I came home from Europe 3 days early and pulled up to my driveway only to find the heavy iron gates locked and a massive pending sale sign staked deeply into my pristine front lawn. But that was not even the worst part of my unexpected arrival. Before I could even process the absolute shock of being locked out of my own multi-million-dollar estate, a blocked number called my cell phone. A frantic, anonymous nurse whispered that my husband was fighting for his very life in the intensive care unit. When I rushed to the hospital in an absolute panic, the waiting room was completely dark and empty. Not a single one of our children was anywhere to be found. Not a single tear was shed. I stood there in absolute disbelief, wondering what kind of nightmare I had just walked into. And then the horrifying truth of their deep, calculated betrayal started to unfold right in front of my eyes. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever had to fight back against greedy, entitled family members who severely underestimated your intelligence and your strength. My name is Valerie. I am 68 years old, and for the past 4 decades, I have been the quiet but incredibly sharp strategic force behind the Coleman Pharmacy Group. My husband Richard and I built a $40 million healthcare empire from the absolute ground up right here in Atlanta. We worked 80-hour weeks, we sacrificed our youth, and we provided our children with a life of extreme luxury and immense privilege. A month ago, my 42-year-old son Marcus and my 45-year-old daughter Denise practically forced me to take a month-long luxury vacation to Paris. They insisted over and over again that I desperately needed to relax and step away from the heavy corporate stress of managing the family business. They promised me they had everything handled and that Richard would be perfectly fine in their care. They were lying through their teeth. I decided to change my flight and come back to Atlanta 3 days early because I had a strange, heavy sinking feeling in my chest that I simply could not shake. It was a mother's intuition telling me that something was incredibly wrong. My private car pulled up to the heavy wrought iron gates of our beautiful estate in the exclusive Buckhead neighborhood. I expected to walk into my quiet, beautifully decorated home, unpack my bags, and surprise my husband. Instead, the gates were completely unresponsive to my security code. I had to instruct my driver to manually open the side pedestrian gate so I could walk up the long, winding driveway. That was when I saw the massive wooden pending sale sign staked directly into my meticulously manicured front lawn. I walked up to the grand mahogany double doors and tried to unlock them, but my heavy brass key would not even slide into the mechanism. The locks had been completely changed. Absolute panic immediately set in. I pulled out my cell phone to call Richard, but before I could even dial his familiar number, my phone began to ring. The caller identification simply showed a blocked number. I answered it and heard the shaky, terrified voice of a woman who quickly identified herself as a nurse at Atlanta General Hospital. She told me, "Mrs. Coleman, you need to get to the intensive care unit right now. Your husband suffered a massive cardiac event, and he is currently on life support fighting for every single breath." She hung up the phone before I could even ask her a single question or find out how long he had been there. I dropped my expensive leather luggage right there on the cold front porch and ran back down the driveway. I ordered my driver to take me straight to the hospital, breaking every single speed limit along the way. My heart was pounding violently against my ribs the entire terrifying ride through the busy Atlanta traffic. Richard was an incredibly healthy 70-year-old man who played tennis 3 times a week, ate a strict diet, and never had a single history of any heart issues whatsoever. Absolutely nothing about this sudden catastrophic medical emergency made any logical sense to me. When I finally reached the intensive care floor, the sterile, overwhelming smell of strong bleach and the constant rhythmic beeping of heavy medical machinery completely consumed my senses. I ran down the long, highly polished white hallway, desperately looking for my family. I fully expected to find my daughter Denise crying hysterically in the designated waiting area. I fully expected to find my son Marcus pacing the floor nervously talking to the lead cardiologists. Instead, I found absolutely nothing. The massive waiting room was completely empty. There were no children sitting in the chairs. There were no tears being shed. There were no hushed conversations about his recovery. There was just a chilling, deadly silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. I frantically checked the room numbers until I finally found Richard's room. I looked through the heavy, rectangular glass window set into the solid wooden door, and the sight completely broke my heart into a million tiny pieces. The strong, vibrant man I had loved and built a massive empire with was lying incredibly still in a sterile hospital bed. He was completely unconscious, hooked up to a massive plastic ventilator tube and surrounded by a dozen complicated machines that were artificially pumping oxygen into his lungs. He looked so incredibly frail, so vulnerable, and so entirely alone in that cold room. I placed my shaking hand against the cold glass, feeling a massive wave of absolute terror and deep confusion wash over me. Where were his children? Where was his entire family while he was lying there fighting for his very life alone? Before I could push the heavy door open and rush to my husband's side, a hospital administrator wearing a sharp gray business suit stepped directly in front of me, blocking my path. She held a thick metal clipboard tightly against her chest and gave me a very cold, highly practiced, sympathetic look. She asked for my name, and when I told her I was Valerie Coleman, his legal wife, she shook her head slowly. "I am so sorry, ma'am," she said, her voice completely devoid of any real human emotion. "But according to the brand new medical power of attorney that was officially filed with the hospital legal department yesterday afternoon, you are absolutely not allowed inside that patient room." I stared at her in absolute complete shock, unable to comprehend the words coming out of her mouth. I told her that I was his legal wife of 40 years, that I was the co-founder of his company, and that I had the absolute unquestionable right to be by his side. The hospital administrator looked down at her metal clipboard and coldly informed me that my spousal rights had been completely legally revoked. She explained in a very clinical tone that the new legal document specifically named Preston, my arrogant, wealthy white son-in-law, as the sole exclusive medical proxy for my husband. Preston was the sleazy corporate investment banker who had married my daughter Denise for her massive trust fund. Only Preston was legally allowed to make medical decisions, authorize surgical procedures, or approve any visitors for Richard. The administrator looked me dead in the eyes and told me that my name was explicitly permanently crossed off the approved visitor list. I was officially barred by law from seeing my own dying husband. I stood in the sterile, bright hallway, feeling the solid hospital floor completely drop out from beneath my feet. A sudden forged medical power of attorney, changed locks on my private multi-million-dollar estate, a pending sale sign on my front lawn, a sudden, completely unexplained massive heart attack. My brilliant, strategic corporate mind immediately began connecting all the terrifying dots. This was absolutely not a tragic, unexpected medical emergency. This was a highly calculated, incredibly vicious, hostile takeover of my entire life and my massive family fortune. I took a slow, unsteady step back from the hospital administrator, trying desperately to catch my breath and process the massive, deadly betrayal that my own children had just orchestrated against me. Suddenly, the heavy metal doors of the hospital elevator chimed incredibly loudly at the far end of the quiet hallway. The shiny silver doors slid open, and Preston stepped out onto the intensive care floor. My sleazy investment banker son-in-law was not rushing to the hospital in a state of panic or grief. He was strolling casually down the hallway, wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit, holding a cup of expensive artisan coffee in his right hand. He was laughing loudly and obnoxiously into his cell phone, completely ignoring the fact that he was walking through a ward where people were actively dying. I stood perfectly still and listened carefully to his conversation. I heard him say clearly and enthusiastically that they were going to secure a massive financial payout by tomorrow morning at the absolute latest. He was literally celebrating his impending wealth while the man who gave his wife everything she ever owned was taking his final artificial breaths just a few feet away. Preston casually turned the corner of the hallway, still chuckling into his expensive phone. His arrogant, smug smile instantly vanished from his face the exact second he made eye contact with me standing outside of Richard's room. He froze completely in his tracks. The color entirely drained from his face, leaving him looking as pale as a ghost. His fingers lost their grip, and he dropped his artisan coffee cup right onto the shiny hospital floor, sending dark liquid splashing everywhere. He realized in that exact terrifying moment that the queen of the Coleman Empire had returned home early from Paris, and his deadly little game was officially over. Preston stopped dead when he saw me standing outside the intensive care unit. The arrogant laugh died in his throat, and his pale face flushed with sudden red. He did not drop to his knees and apologize for celebrating my husband's impending death. He did not offer me a comforting hug or a shoulder to cry on. Instead, he went on the offensive, acting as if I had committed a massive crime by showing up. He took a threatening step toward me, completely ignoring the coffee pooling on the hospital floor. He raised his voice, demanding to know why I had returned 3 days early without any prior warning. He accused me of deliberately trying to interfere with the strict medical protocol they had established for Richard. He pointed a shaking finger at my face and told me that my sudden presence was causing unnecessary stress for the medical staff and jeopardizing the careful transition of the family estate. I stared at this sleazy investment banker, feeling a cold, calculated fury beginning to replace my initial shock. I asked him calmly how a devoted wife returning to her dying husband could possibly be considered an interference. He ignored my question and continued to berate me, telling me that my controlling nature was what had driven this family apart. He told me that I had no legal right to be standing in that hallway and needed to leave the premises immediately before he called hospital security to forcibly remove me. Before Preston could formulate another lie to justify his cruelty, the heavy double doors of the intensive care ward swung open. My 45-year-old daughter Denise and my 42-year-old son Marcus marched down the hallway. They were dressed in dark designer clothing, looking as if they had just stepped out of a high-end brochure rather than rushing to a devastating medical emergency. I felt a brief, desperate flicker of hope. I foolishly thought that my own children would run into my arms and stand by my side, but there were no warm hugs. There were no tears of sorrow in their cold eyes. Denise walked right up to me, and her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure irritation. She did not ask how my long international flight was or how my heart was holding up. Instead, she hissed at me under her breath, accusing me of causing a massive public scene in the middle of a quiet hospital ward. She told me I was embarrassing the family and needed to lower my voice and compose myself immediately. She acted as if my grief was a tremendous inconvenience to her busy daily schedule. I looked at the daughter I had carried for 9 months, the daughter whose lavish lifestyle I had completely funded, and I saw nothing but a cold, greedy stranger staring back at me. I realized in that heartbreaking moment that the beautiful little girl I had raised was entirely gone, replaced by a ruthless woman who only cared about her impending inheritance and her pristine social image. Marcus stood right beside his sister, confidently crossing his arms over his expensive, tailored suit. He looked at me with a sickening, familiar sneer that he had clearly perfected over the past month. He did not look at the heavy wooden door behind me, where his father was actively fighting for his life on a plastic ventilator. He looked directly into my eyes and delivered a highly rehearsed, cruel speech designed to completely break my spirit and force my submission. He told me that Dad always said I was far too controlling with the corporate finances. Marcus claimed that Richard had secretly resented me for decades because I constantly managed the pharmaceutical empire with an iron fist, refusing to let the children have any real executive power or access to the massive corporate bank accounts. He said that my overbearing nature was the exact reason why Dad had finally decided to give them the absolute reins to the company while I was distracted touring museums in Paris. Marcus smiled a cruel, deeply satisfying smile and told me that Richard finally realized his children were the true, brilliant visionaries of the Coleman Pharmacy Group. He boldly claimed that my outdated conservative business strategies were holding them back from massive financial expansion, and that Dad had finally woken up to the truth. He was actively trying to rewrite 40 years of our beautiful marriage right in front of my face. He was trying to convince me that the man who had loved me endlessly and relied on my sharp strategic mind for his entire corporate career had suddenly completely betrayed me the second my plane took off for Europe. He wanted me to believe that I was entirely alone and universally despised by the very man I had spent my life building an empire alongside. Preston stepped forward again, sensing that Marcus had successfully delivered the heavy emotional blow to my heart. Preston reached into the inside pocket of his expensive suit jacket and pulled out a thick, heavily folded legal document. He did not hand it to me respectfully or offer me a chance to read it in peace. He coldly waved the heavy paper right in my face, making sure I clearly saw the official blue county seals and the bold black signatures stamped at the very bottom of the pages. He told me that the document was a legally binding, comprehensive medical and financial power of attorney. Preston stated with absolute smug confidence that Richard had willingly signed the document exactly 3 weeks ago, effectively transferring all major decision-making power directly to him. Preston lowered his voice to a chilling, sinister whisper, ensuring that the nearby nurses and hospital staff could not hear his monstrous words. He told me that Richard was completely brain dead and that there was absolutely no hope for any medical recovery whatsoever. He said that keeping my husband hooked up to those loud machines was incredibly cruel, incredibly unnatural, and entirely a waste of valuable hospital resources. Then Preston delivered the ultimate horrifying threat that completely stopped the blood in my veins. He coldly informed me that as the sole legal medical proxy, he and the children had already held a meeting and made the final devastating decision. They were officially pulling the plug tomorrow at exactly 12 o'clock noon to finally end his suffering and let him pass away in peace. Preston looked at me with absolutely dead sociopathic eyes and told me to go back to my hotel room, pack my bags, and quietly wait for the funeral arrangements to be sent to my email. He told me that my presence was no longer required or desired by anyone in the family. They expected me to completely collapse onto the sterile hospital floor in a puddle of tears. They expected me to burst into hysterical screaming and beg them for mercy on my hands and knees. They truly believed that the quiet, elegant woman who had meticulously planned their birthday parties and managed their private trust funds was completely powerless against their aggressive legal trap and their united front. But I did not shed a single tear. I did not scream or throw a childish, helpless tantrum. I simply looked past them, looking directly through the heavy rectangular glass window of the hospital room. I looked at the complicated medical machinery surrounding my dying husband. Over the past 40 years of managing a massive pharmaceutical empire, I had learned how to read complex medical charts and accurately identify thousands of different intravenous medications. I noticed a very subtle, terrifying detail hanging on the tall metal pole right next to his bed. The intravenous fluid bag pumping directly into his veins did not match the standard cardiac protocol for a man with his specific medical history. It was a highly specialized beta blocker dosage that would actively suppress the heart rate of a man who was already incredibly weak. The medical math simply did not add up, and the dosage was completely lethal. I turned my attention back to Preston and my 2 greedy children. I looked at them with an icy, absolute calm that made Denise physically take a step backward in fear. I looked directly at Preston and told him that he was awfully eager to bury a man who was still actively breathing. I did not wait for his shocked response or his pathetic excuses. I turned my back on the 3 monsters I used to call my family and walked purposefully down the long, white hallway. I did not walk toward the exit to find a cheap hotel room to cry in. I walked directly toward the executive elevators. I was going straight to the private office of the chief of medicine, and I was bringing the absolute wrath of a queen who had just realized her king was being actively murdered. I walked out of Atlanta General Hospital with a singular burning focus. I did not waste my time crying in the back seat of my luxury town car, and I certainly did not head back to a cheap hotel to wait for instructions from a sleazy investment banker. I gave my driver a single address located in the heart of the downtown financial district. I was going to see Mr. Holloway. Mr. Holloway was not just an ordinary family attorney. He was a ruthless legal predator who had spent his entire career tearing apart corporate enemies and protecting the vast fortunes of the Atlanta elite. When I arrived at his prestigious high-rise office, the receptionist took one look at my face and immediately ushered me into his massive glass-walled conference room. Mr. Holloway walked in a few moments later, wearing his signature tailored charcoal suit and a very grim expression. He did not offer me a warm greeting or platitudes about my dying husband. He knew exactly who I was, and he knew that we did not have a single second to waste on meaningless pleasantries. I sat down in the heavy leather chair and looked across the polished mahogany table. I told him everything that had just happened in the intensive care unit. I told him about the changed locks on my estate, the pending sale sign, the sudden unexplained cardiac event, and the forged medical power of attorney that Preston had so proudly waved in my face. Mr. Holloway listened to my entire story without interrupting once. When I finished speaking, he opened his laptop and began pulling up the secure legal registries and corporate financial databases to uncover what my greedy children had been doing while they forced me to take a vacation in Paris. The quiet humming of the computer server in the background felt incredibly loud in the tense silence of the room. After several agonizing minutes, Mr. Holloway stopped typing and turned the bright laptop screen toward me. The horrifying truth of their calculated betrayal was staring back at me in bold black and white text. Preston and Marcus had not just forged a simple medical proxy document, they had completely orchestrated a massive hostile takeover of the entire Coleman Pharmacy Group. Mr. Holloway pointed to a newly filed document stamped with official county seals. It was a completely forged amendment to our Revocable Living Trust. Richard and I had established that trust decades ago to protect our legacy, but the document sitting on the screen had been illegally altered while I was overseas. The forged amendment explicitly removed me as the primary beneficiary and the Keogh trustee. It completely stripped me of my executive voting rights and transferred immediate total control of the $40 million healthcare empire directly to my son Marcus and my son-in-law Preston. They had used the sudden severe hospitalization of my husband as the perfect legal loophole to activate the forged trust. Because Richard was officially incapacitated and relying entirely on a plastic ventilator to breathe, Preston used his fake medical power of attorney to declare Richard mentally incompetent. That specific medical declaration automatically triggered the fraudulent trust amendment, handing them the entire keys to the kingdom without any legal pushback. I stared at the screen, realizing that they had planned this intricate trap for months, carefully waiting for the perfect moment to strike when I was thousands of miles away across the ocean. They had deliberately used my temporary absence as the ultimate weapon against me, completely destroying everything we had built up. But the absolute depth of their greed did not stop at stealing the corporate pharmaceutical empire. Mr. Holloway clicked on another digital folder and brought up the current real estate listings for the exclusive Buckhead neighborhood. The massive multi-million-dollar estate that Richard and I had designed from the ground up, the home where I had raised those ungrateful children, was currently listed for a rapid emergency cash sale. That explained the heavy wooden pending sale sign staked deeply into my manicured front lawn and the completely changed locks on my mahogany front door. They were actively liquidating my private sanctuary. I asked Mr. Holloway why they were in such an incredibly desperate rush to sell my home when they had just stolen a $40 million corporate business. Mr. Holloway pulled up a highly confidential financial background report on Preston. The sleazy corporate investment banker who always wore custom Italian suits and bragged about his massive wealth was actually drowning in a sea of catastrophic debt. Preston had recently made several incredibly reckless and highly illegal investments using borrowed money. His hidden offshore bank accounts were completely empty, and his wealthy creditors were aggressively demanding immediate payment. Preston owed over $5 million to people who do not forgive debts, and his own luxury properties were already quietly facing foreclosure. He had married my daughter Denise simply to access her trust fund, but when that was not enough, he convinced my weak, entitled son Marcus to help him steal the entire family fortune. They were selling my beloved home to the highest bidder, simply to pay off the massive hidden investment debts that Preston had accumulated over the past 3 incredibly disastrous years of his pathetic professional career, leaving him completely broken and absolutely desperate for immediate cash. As I sat there processing the absolute sickening reality of their actions, my cell phone buzzed softly in my designer handbag. I pulled it out and saw a notification from social media. I rarely used the application, but kept an account to monitor the public behavior of my foolish children. I opened the notification and felt a cold, sharp rage pierce directly through my chest. It was a brand new photograph posted by Chloe, the vain and useless white socialite who had married my son Marcus. The photograph was taken inside an exclusive luxury car dealership in downtown Atlanta. Chloe was standing proudly next to a brand new imported sports car, holding a glass of expensive champagne and flashing a bright, arrogant smile for the camera. But it was not the expensive car that caught my attention. It was the jewelry hanging around her neck. Chloe was wearing my custom heirloom diamond necklace. It was a priceless vintage piece that Richard had bought for me in London for our 20th wedding anniversary. I kept that necklace securely locked inside my hidden floor safe in the master bedroom of my Buckhead estate. They had not only locked me out of my own home, but they had completely raided my most intimate personal belongings. The caption underneath her photograph made my stomach turn. It said, "Celebrating our early inheritance with a new toy and big moves coming soon." She tagged the luxury car dealership and added several heart emojis. While the man who funded her entire lavish lifestyle was lying in a hospital bed with machines breathing for him, she was gleefully parading around the city wearing stolen diamonds and spending stolen money. She was mocking my pain and celebrating the absolute destruction of my family right in front of the world. I slowly set my cell phone down on the polished mahogany table and looked across at Mr. Holloway. My hands were perfectly steady and my voice entirely devoid of emotion. I told my attorney that we needed to file an immediate federal injunction to freeze the corporate assets and block the sale of my private estate. But Mr. Holloway did not agree with my rapid plan. He closed his laptop and let out a heavy sigh. He looked at me with a serious expression. He told me that filing a civil injunction right now would not save my husband or my empire. Mr. Holloway explained the terrifying reality of the legal trap they had successfully built. Because Preston held the medical power of attorney, he had the absolute right to dictate the medical treatment for Richard. The hospital was legally bound to follow his orders regardless of my protests. Mr. Holloway leaned forward, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. Preston and Marcus did not actually need the corporate revenue right away to survive. Richard had a personal life insurance policy worth exactly $10 million. The primary beneficiary listed on that specific policy was the legally appointed executor of the new forged trust. Preston had absolute control and stood to gain $10 million in liquid cash the exact second my husband took his last artificial breath. Mr. Holloway looked me dead in the eyes, delivering the ultimate cliffhanger. He told me that Preston and the children were legally authorized to turn off the life support machines tomorrow at noon. If Richard dies tomorrow, Mr. Holloway whispered, the medical proxy permanently blocks any immediate autopsy. The $10 million insurance payout is automatically triggered, and the kids win everything before we can get a judge to review the documents. The drive back to the Buckhead estate felt entirely different than my panicked arrival just hours earlier. I was no longer a terrified wife rushing to understand a medical emergency. I was a brilliant corporate strategist who had just uncovered a massive hostile takeover orchestrated by my own blood. I instructed my driver to park his vehicle down the street, hidden from the view of the main gates. I walked the remaining distance, feeling the warm Atlanta air against my skin. The heavy wrought iron gates were firmly locked, but they were no match for the architect of this empire. When Richard and I built this massive estate 30 years ago, I personally oversaw the installation of the comprehensive security system. I knew that ambitious men often made enemies, so I had the security company program a hidden master override code directly into the mainframe. It was a digital skeleton key that could never be deleted or altered by any standard user. I walked up to the sleek digital keypad mounted on the stone pillar and typed in the 9-digit sequence. The heavy iron gates clicked open, swinging wide to welcome the true owner back to her own property. I walked up the long, winding driveway, my heels clicking softly against the dark pavement. As I approached the main house, I noticed a dozen luxury vehicles parked haphazardly across the manicured lawn. The massive mahogany front doors were completely wide open, and loud bass-heavy music was echoing out from the grand foyer. I stepped onto the elevated marble porch and walked directly into my own home. The sight that greeted me was absolutely sickening. My 42-year-old son Marcus and his vain white socialite wife Chloe were throwing a massive catered party in my own house. There were at least 50 wealthy strangers wandering through my pristine living room. They were holding delicate crystal glasses filled with expensive champagne and eating tiny appetizers carried by hired servers wearing crisp white uniforms. Chloe was standing near the grand sweeping staircase, wearing a ridiculous sequined cocktail dress that was completely inappropriate for a midday gathering. She was laughing loudly with a group of her shallow country club friends, pointing at my antique furniture and making grand sweeping gestures. They were actually celebrating the sale of my own home, while my husband was suffocating on a hospital ventilator. I walked slowly into the grand living room, projecting an aura of absolute ice-cold authority. The hired servers immediately sensed the drastic shift in the atmosphere and quickly backed away against the walls. A few of the wealthy guests noticed my intense silent presence and stopped talking, their arrogant smiles fading as they awkwardly lowered their champagne glasses. Chloe finally turned around and saw me standing in the center of the room. She did not even look ashamed or embarrassed by her disgusting behavior. She simply rolled her eyes, let out a dramatic sigh, and walked directly toward me. Chloe stopped a few feet away from me, taking a slow, deliberate sip from her crystal glass. She looked me up and down with a condescending sneer. "It is finally over, Valerie," she said, her voice loud enough for her wealthy friends to hear. "You really should not have come back here today. Preston has all the legal rights now, and the trust has been completely transferred. We are selling this massive, outdated house by the end of the week. You are going to get a small monthly stipend, so just go quietly away to a retirement home and disappear." I looked at the foolish woman standing in front of me, wearing my heirloom diamond necklace around her neck. She honestly believed that a forged piece of paper gave her the absolute right to disrespect the woman who had built the very floor she was standing on. Marcus noticed the sudden commotion and hurried over from the formal dining room. He looked nervous, but he tried to put on an incredibly arrogant face for his wealthy friends. He stood next to his wife and crossed his arms, telling me that I was trespassing on my property and needed to leave. I did not raise my voice or engage in a pathetic screaming match with these foolish children. I simply ignored their entire existence. I walked right past Chloe, completely brushing my shoulder against her sequined dress, and headed straight for the sweeping staircase. Marcus yelled at me, demanding to know where I was going, but I did not stop. I walked up the stairs and headed directly down the long hallway toward the master bedroom. I locked the heavy bedroom door behind me, shutting out the loud music and the arrogant voices of the people downstairs invading my private sanctuary. I walked over to the massive walk-in closet and moved a heavy velvet ottoman out of the way. I peeled back a small section of the plush carpet, revealing a flush metal panel embedded directly into the concrete foundation. I knelt down and entered a complex biometric passcode that Richard and I had established decades ago. The heavy metal safe hissed open, releasing a puff of stale air. I did not care about the stacks of emergency cash or the velvet boxes filled with expensive jewelry. I was only looking for one specific item hidden at the very bottom. I reached into the dark safe and pulled out a slim black leather briefcase. Inside this briefcase were the original foundational incorporation documents for the Coleman Pharmacy Group. These were the highly confidential legal papers that Preston and Marcus had failed to find when they were searching the corporate offices for leverage. I snapped the briefcase shut and stood up, feeling the immense, undeniable weight of true power resting comfortably in my hands. I smoothed my elegant skirt, took a slow, deep breath to compose myself, and unlocked the heavy bedroom door to face the greedy vultures waiting right outside. I walked slowly back down the grand staircase, holding the black leather briefcase tightly by my side. The loud music had been turned off, and the entire living room was completely silent. The 50 wealthy guests were standing around awkwardly whispering to one another and watching my every move. Marcus and Chloe were standing at the bottom of the stairs, looking annoyed and impatient. They genuinely thought I had gone upstairs to pack a few sweaters and cry over my lost fortune. They had absolutely no idea that I was holding the exact weapon that would finally completely destroy them. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped right in front of the massive crowd of wealthy socialites. I looked around the room, making deliberate, direct eye contact with the people who had come to celebrate the theft of my entire life. I looked at Chloe, who was still holding her half-empty glass of champagne. I offered her a small, cold smile. I spoke with a quiet, steady voice that carried clearly across the silent room. "Drink up," I told the party guests. "It is the last glass of champagne any of you will ever truly afford today." A ripple of confused, nervous laughter spread through the crowd. Chloe rolled her eyes, completely missing the deadly serious tone of my voice. Marcus stepped forward, his face flushing a bright, angry red. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a folded piece of thick legal paper. He aggressively shoved the paper directly against my chest, forcing me to take it. It was a formal legal trespassing notice signed by Preston, authorizing the local police to arrest me if I ever returned to the estate. Marcus told me to get out and never ever come right back. I looked down at the worthless piece of paper in my hand and then looked back up at the pathetic son I had raised. I did not say another word. I turned around and walked out the grand mahogany front doors, leaving the party guests standing in awkward silence. I walked across the elevated marble porch and headed down the long driveway toward my waiting car. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the manicured lawn. Just as I reached the heavy iron gates, my cell phone began to vibrate violently in my designer leather handbag. I pulled the phone out and saw an unknown local number flashing on the screen. I answered it, expecting it to be my attorney, Mr. Holloway, with an update on the federal injunction. Instead, I heard the terrified voice of the loyal intensive care nurse from the hospital. She was whispering frantically into the receiver. "Mrs. Coleman," she said, her voice shaking with adrenaline. "I was packing up your husband's personal belongings from his locker, and I found something hidden inside his jacket pocket. You need to hear this audio recording immediately before they pull the plug out permanently tomorrow." The sun had completely set by the time my driver pulled into the subterranean parking garage of Atlanta General Hospital. The lower levels were completely empty and dimly lit by flickering fluorescent bulbs that cast long, sinister shadows against the cold concrete walls. I told my driver to turn off the engine and keep the headlights dark. I sat in the back seat of the luxury sedan, feeling the heavy leather briefcase resting against my legs. My mind was racing, trying to process the frantic phone call I had just received from the intensive care nurse. She had told me she found something hidden in my husband's personal belongings. She told me it was a matter of life and death. I rolled down my tinted window just a few inches and let the cool, damp air of the parking garage fill the quiet vehicle. I did not have to wait very long. A few minutes later, a small figure emerged from the concrete stairwell, looking around nervously. It was Nurse Maya. She was a young, brilliant African-American woman who had been working in the cardiac intensive care unit for over 5 years. I had noticed her earlier that day when Preston was aggressively throwing me out of the ward. Maya had been standing quietly by the nursing station, watching the entire horrible scene unfold, with a look of deep suspicion and profound empathy in her dark eyes. Maya walked quickly over to my car, clutching a small plastic belongings bag tightly against her chest. She was still wearing her blue medical scrubs, and her face looked incredibly exhausted and terrified. I unlocked the heavy car door and gestured for her to slide into the back seat next to me. She closed the door quickly, sealing us inside the quiet, luxury vehicle. Maya took a deep, shaky breath and looked me directly in the eyes. She told me that she had felt something was incredibly wrong ever since my husband was admitted to the hospital. She explained that Preston had been hovering over the medical staff like a vulture, constantly demanding updates and aggressively pushing the doctors to declare Richard brain dead as fast as possible. Maya said that when Preston ordered the nursing staff to pack up my husband's personal clothing to be thrown away, she decided to do a thorough check of his expensive suit jacket. She told me she felt a hard, rectangular object deliberately sewn into the interior lining of his breast pocket. It was his encrypted smartphone. Maya carefully cut the lining open and pulled the device out. Because she was highly observant, she had noticed that the voice recording application was still actively running in the background, secretly capturing audio for the past 4 days. Maya reached into the plastic bag and handed the heavy black smartphone directly to me. Her hands were shaking violently as she told me that I needed to listen to the final audio file saved on the device. She said she had listened to the first few minutes and immediately knew she had to contact me secretly before Preston returned to the hospital to finalize the termination of life support. I took the cold digital device from her trembling hands and looked at the glowing screen. There was a single audio file titled with the date of the exact night before my husband was rushed to the hospital. I pressed the play button and turned the volume all the way up so the sound filled the quiet luxury car. At first, there was only the soft rustling of fabric and the faint background noise of the television playing in our Buckhead estate. Then I heard the incredibly strong, familiar voice of my husband. Hearing his deep, steady voice brought a sudden, painful lump to my throat. Richard was speaking calmly, but his tone was laced with a deep, profound disappointment. He was talking directly to our son Marcus and our sleazy son-in-law Preston. I listened in absolute horror as the recorded conversation began to rapidly escalate into a violent confrontation. Preston was raising his voice aggressively, demanding that Richard immediately sign the comprehensive medical and financial power of attorney documents. Preston sounded completely unhinged, yelling that the company needed modern leadership and that Richard was becoming too old and entirely incompetent to run the pharmaceutical empire. Marcus chimed in right after Preston, his voice completely weak and pathetic. Marcus told his father to just sign the papers and make it easy for everyone so they could finally have their rightful inheritance. The audio recording captured the exact moment my husband realized he had raised a monster and welcomed a snake into his family. Richard flatly and absolutely refused to sign the documents. He told Preston that he knew all about his massive hidden investment debts and his failing offshore accounts. Richard boldly stated that he was going to contact the corporate lawyers the very next morning to officially remove both Marcus and Preston from the executive board and completely cut them out of the family trust. He told them they were greedy, foolish men who would never get a single dime of the Coleman fortune as long as he was still breathing. The silence on the recording lasted for only a few terrifying seconds before absolute chaos erupted. The audio captured the loud, unmistakable sound of a violent physical struggle. There was the sound of heavy furniture crashing to the floor and glass shattering against the hardwood. I heard Richard let out a muffled groan of pain as if someone had violently shoved him against the wall. And then I heard the chilling sociopathic voice of Preston echoing through the small speaker of the phone. Preston was breathing heavily as he ordered Marcus to hold his father down. Preston told Marcus to just give him the extra dosage of the highly concentrated beta blockers. Preston coldly and confidently stated that the massive overdose would immediately slow Richard's heart rate down to a fatal level, and it would look exactly like a natural sudden heart attack to the responding paramedics. I sat in the dark luxury car completely frozen in pure, unadulterated terror. The audio file ended with the terrible sound of my husband gasping for air as the lethal medication was violently forced into his system. The heavy silence that followed the end of the recording was absolutely deafening. The pieces of the massive, terrifying puzzle finally completely snapped together in my mind. The subtle, terrifying detail I had noticed earlier on the intravenous fluid bag hanging next to his hospital bed suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. They did not just steal his $40 million company. They did not just forge a trust amendment and illegally list my private estate for a rapid emergency sale. My son and my son-in-law had actively, purposefully, and maliciously poisoned my husband in his own home. They had deliberately induced his current coma to seize control of the pharmaceutical empire before he could fire them. It was not just a case of massive corporate fraud and elder abuse. It was cold-blooded, calculated, attempted murder. They were actively killing the man who gave them absolutely everything they ever wanted. Nurse Maya was crying softly beside me in the back seat of the car. She whispered that we needed to call the local Atlanta Police Department right now and hand the smartphone directly to the detectives. She said the audio recording was undeniable, absolute proof of their violent crime. But my brilliant strategic mind was already operating 10 steps ahead of her panicked suggestion. I looked at the dark concrete wall of the parking garage and felt a cold, terrifying calm wash over my entire body. I slowly shook my head and told Maya that we absolutely could not go to the local authorities right now. I explained to her that Preston was a wealthy, well-connected corporate investment banker. If I handed that phone to the local police tonight, Preston would immediately hire the most expensive, ruthless criminal defense lawyers in the entire state of Georgia. His highly paid legal team would immediately file endless injunctions claiming the audio recording was illegally obtained or completely manipulated. They would drag the local investigation out for months, tying the police up in endless bureaucratic red tape. And while the local police were busy fighting his expensive lawyers in court, Preston would still legally hold the active medical power of attorney. He would absolutely use that legal authority to walk right into the intensive care unit tomorrow at noon and permanently turn off the life support machines before the police could ever stop him. He would successfully murder my husband, collect the $10 million life insurance payout, and walk away completely free. I turned to Maya and looked directly into her terrified eyes. I told her that a standard local police investigation was absolutely not going to save my husband or destroy these monsters. I needed a much bigger trap. I needed a trap so massive and so legally inescapable that no amount of money or high-priced lawyers could ever save them from total, absolute ruin. I reached out and gently squeezed her hand. I told the brave nurse that I needed her to do exactly what I said without asking any questions. I instructed Maya to go back up to the intensive care unit and manipulate the digital medical monitors. I told her to secretly adjust the intravenous medication drip to stabilize his heart rate and counteract the lethal beta blockers they were pumping into his veins. I looked at her with the absolute heavy authority of a woman who was preparing to unleash pure hell on her enemies. I told Maya to keep my husband alive for exactly 48 more hours, no matter what she had to do. I told her to let Preston and Marcus walk into that hospital room tomorrow at noon and genuinely believe they were pulling the plug and winning the ultimate prize. I was going to let them build their fraudulent, arrogant house of cards all the way to the very top. I told Maya that when they finally reached out to grasp their stolen inheritance, I would be waiting in the shadows to completely obliterate their entire existence. The 48 hours leading up to Thursday morning felt like an eternity suspended in cold, dark water. I spent those 2 agonizing days sitting completely alone in the quiet corners of my newly rented luxury apartment, meticulously finalizing every single detail of the massive legal trap I had set for my ungrateful children. I did not sleep for a single second, and I absolutely did not eat anything. I simply sat by the large window and watched the clock ticking forward, waiting patiently for the exact moment when their arrogant greed would finally push them over the absolute edge of no return. Nurse Maya had kept her dangerous promise to me despite the massive risks to her own medical career. She had secretly adjusted the intravenous drip very slowly, stabilizing Richard's heart rate and buying us the precious critical time we desperately needed to execute this plan. When Thursday morning finally arrived, the sky over the city of Atlanta was a heavy, suffocating shade of gray that perfectly mirrored the somber mood of the hospital. I dressed myself with extreme care in a beautifully tailored charcoal gray power suit, completely refusing to wear traditional black mourning clothes because I absolutely refused to accept that this was the end of my husband's incredible life. I arrived at Atlanta General Hospital exactly 1 full hour before the scheduled termination of life support. I walked quietly into the intensive care unit and took my designated place in the far dark corner of his private room, standing completely still and silent like a ghost waiting to witness a cold-blooded murder. The heavy, complicated medical machines were still aggressively pumping artificial air into his fragile lungs, keeping him tethered to this world. I looked down at his peaceful, resting face and silently promised him that the terrible people who did this to him were about to lose absolutely everything they valued. At exactly 15 minutes to noon, the heavy double doors of the intensive care ward swung open. I could clearly hear the loud, arrogant clicking of designer heels echoing down the highly polished hospital hallway before they entered the room. My 45-year-old daughter Denise and my 42-year-old son Marcus marched confidently into the room, followed closely by their greedy spouses. They were putting on a completely grotesque theatrical performance of manufactured grief for the nursing staff. They were wearing incredibly expensive high-end designer morning clothes that looked like they belonged on the glossy cover of a dark fashion magazine rather than in a tragic, sterile hospital room. Denise was wearing a massive black, wide-brimmed sun hat and a tightly tailored black dress, clutching a brand-new imported leather handbag she had undoubtedly purchased with the stolen corporate funds. Marcus was wearing a sharp, custom black Italian suit, looking around the crowded room with a poorly concealed expression of intense, overwhelming relief. But it was Preston and his ridiculous wife Chloe who truly made my blood boil with pure, unadulterated rage. They were practically vibrating with suppressed excitement, unable to hide their greedy anticipation. Chloe was standing near the doorway, frantically texting on her cell phone, likely confirming the delivery of the new luxury sports car she had proudly posted about just 2 days prior. Preston walked directly into the center of the room with his chest puffed out, acting exactly like the absolute king of a newly conquered castle. He did not bother to look down at the frail man lying helpless in the hospital bed. His greedy, calculating eyes were entirely focused on the digital wall clock, counting down the final agonizing minutes until the massive $10 million life insurance policy would automatically trigger and deposit directly into his failing offshore bank accounts. They were standing mere feet away from their dying father, completely consumed by their desperate, relentless thirst for his money, completely devoid of any basic human compassion. Preston noticed me standing quietly in the dark, shadowed corner of the room, observing their behavior. He let out a dramatic sigh and rolled his eyes, acting annoyed by my silent presence. He walked over to the end of the hospital bed and crossed his arms, looking at me with a smug and condescending expression. He spoke with a harsh, arrogant tone, telling me that I was making this process incredibly awkward and that I should have stayed home to pack my belongings for the retirement community he had chosen for me. I did not say a single word in response to his pathetic insults. I simply stared right through him, letting my cold silence unnerve his fragile ego. A few moments later, the chief attending physician walked slowly into the room, carrying a thick metal clipboard. The doctor looked incredibly uncomfortable, avoiding my eyes completely, as he handed the clipboard directly to Preston. The doctor explained in a quiet, somber voice that these were the official mandated hospital consent forms required by state law to permanently terminate the artificial life support systems. He told Preston that once the documents were signed, the respiratory therapist would immediately enter the room, disconnect the ventilator, and administer a heavy dose of liquid morphine to ensure the patient passed away quickly and without any physical pain. Preston did not bother to read a single line of the complicated legal documents. He eagerly pulled an expensive silver pen from his breast pocket and aggressively clicked it open. He looked directly across the hospital bed at me, a malicious smile spreading across his pale, sweaty face. He leaned over the metal clipboard and looked me dead in the eyes with absolute chilling confidence. "It is time to finally say goodbye, Valerie," he said, his voice dripping with absolute venom and sheer arrogant victory. "We are the sole executors now, and your outdated reign over this family is officially over." He pressed the silver pen firmly against the paper and signed his name with a sweeping flourish. He handed the clipboard back to the physician, looking deeply proud of himself. Denise pulled a tissue from her handbag and began dramatically dabbing her dry eyes, preparing for her theatrical performance of a grieving daughter. Chloe let out an excited squeal and quickly covered her mouth, pretending it was a sob of sorrow. They genuinely believed they had completely won the ultimate prize. They thought the legal trap they built was flawless, and they were walking out today as untouchable multimillionaires. The physician took the clipboard and gave a short, solemn nod. He told the family he needed to step outside to retrieve the respiratory therapy team. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, leaving us trapped in a thick, suffocating silence, broken only by the rhythmic hissing of the mechanical ventilator. Preston checked his gold watch and smirked at Marcus, whispering that the insurance money would clear by tomorrow afternoon. But the respiratory therapists never arrived. Instead, the heavy wooden door of the intensive care room was suddenly pushed open, with a massive violent force making Chloe jump backward in sheer terror. The physician walked rapidly back into the room, but immediately stepped aside, pressing his back tightly against the wall. He was followed closely by 3 intimidating men wearing sharp, dark suits and stern, unyielding expressions. They were not local police officers, and they were certainly not hospital security guards. They walked into the room carrying the heavy, undeniable authority of the federal government. The man in the center stepped forward, pulling a leather badge wallet from his jacket and flipping it open for everyone to see. He looked directly at Preston with eyes that were as cold as solid ice. The man announced with a booming voice that echoed off the sterile walls that they were official federal agents representing the United States Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General. Preston dropped his arms, his mouth falling slightly open in a state of total confusion. Denise stopped her fake crying instantly, completely frozen in place, while Marcus took a terrified, stumbling step backward away from his father. The lead agent looked down at the signed termination form sitting on the medical cart and then looked back up at the sheer horror rapidly spreading across the pale faces of my ungrateful children. The agent spoke again, delivering the ultimate crushing blow that completely shattered their arrogant illusion of victory in a matter of mere seconds. Life support cannot and will not be terminated today under any circumstances, the federal agent announced, his booming voice leaving no room for any legal debate. This unconscious patient and his entire corporate medical history are right now the explicit central subject of an active federal criminal investigation for massive Medicare fraud and severe violent elder abuse. Nobody touches this machine, and nobody leaves this room. Preston's face went completely white as the heavy silver pen slipped from his trembling fingers, hitting the cold hospital floor with a loud, undeniable finality. The heavy silence that followed the federal agent's declaration was abruptly shattered by an explosive outburst of pure, frantic panic from Preston. The sleazy investment banker completely lost whatever remained of his manufactured composure. He aggressively shoved the hospital physician out of his way and marched directly up to the lead federal agent. Preston was practically foaming at the mouth, his face turning an angry mottled shade of purple. He began screaming at the top of his lungs, completely disregarding the fact that he was standing in the middle of a critical intensive care unit. He aggressively waved the forged medical power of attorney in the face of the federal investigator, demanding that the agents immediately vacate the hospital room. Preston shouted that he was the sole legally appointed medical proxy and the exclusive executive director of the Coleman Pharmacy Group. He declared loudly that the termination of life support was a private family matter that had absolutely nothing to do with the federal government. He threatened to call his elite team of corporate lawyers and file a massive multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the hospital administration for allowing unauthorized personnel to interfere with his legal rights. He screamed that he would personally ensure the federal agents lost their badges and their pensions for overstepping their jurisdiction. The 3 federal agents did not even flinch. They stood like an impenetrable wall of solid concrete, completely unbothered by the desperate temper tantrum of a cornered criminal. The lead agent calmly adjusted his suit jacket and looked at Preston with an expression of absolute profound pity, mixed with deep professional disgust. He did not raise his voice to match the hysterical screaming of my son-in-law. He simply stated that a local medical power of attorney does not supersede an active federal criminal mandate. Preston continued to scream, his voice cracking under the immense pressure of his rapidly collapsing scheme. Marcus was standing frozen near the mechanical ventilator, his eyes darting frantically back and forth between the armed federal agents and the heavy wooden door. Marcus was a coward who had always hidden behind the aggressive arrogance of other men, and now he was entirely trapped with absolutely nowhere to run. Denise was clutching her expensive imported leather handbag against her chest, breathing heavily and looking completely lost. She had built her entire identity on the illusion of absolute control and flawless public image, but that pristine image was actively disintegrating right in front of her eyes. Chloe was backed into the far corner of the sterile hospital room, her hands covering her mouth as she realized her massive shopping spree was about to be abruptly canceled. I watched them completely unravel for a few incredibly satisfying moments before I finally decided to step out of the dark, shadowed corner of the room. The sharp clicking of my heels against the polished hospital floor cut through the chaotic noise of Preston's screaming. I walked slowly and deliberately toward the center of the room, stopping just a few feet away from the federal agents. Preston suddenly stopped yelling, his eyes locking onto my calm, unbothered face. He pointed a shaking finger at me and accused me of calling the federal authorities to enact some petty, jealous revenge. He told the agents that I was just a bitter, estranged wife who had been legally removed from the family trust and that my claims of fraud were completely fabricated. I did not look at Preston. I looked directly at my son Marcus, who was physically trembling in his expensive custom black Italian suit. I spoke with a quiet, steady voice that commanded absolute, undeniable authority, forcing everyone in the room to stop and listen to every single word. I told them that they had spent the last month focusing entirely on forging local trust amendments and stealing physical real estate deeds. I explained that they were so incredibly blinded by their desperate greed that they completely forgot exactly who built the foundation of the massive pharmaceutical empire they were trying to steal. I reminded them that I was not just a quiet housewife who planned elegant dinner parties. I was the top corporate strategist for the Coleman Pharmacy Group for over 4 decades. I knew every single legal loophole, every corporate vulnerability, and every single federal regulation that governed our massive industry. I turned my gaze directly to Preston, letting my cold eyes pierce through his arrogant facade. I told him that 5 years ago, when the healthcare industry began experiencing a massive wave of hostile corporate takeovers, I had quietly embedded a highly classified dead hand fraud clause directly into the foundational legal charter of our company. I explained the terrifying reality of that clause slowly and deliberately, so his arrogant brain could fully comprehend his absolute destruction. I stated that because our $40 million pharmacy network processes millions of dollars in federal Medicare and Medicaid funds every single year, our corporate operations are strictly bound by the United States Department of Health and Human Services. The dead hand clause explicitly dictated that if the primary chief executive officer suffered any sudden, unexplained, life-threatening medical emergency while control of the company was simultaneously being contested or rapidly transferred, an automatic federal freeze would be immediately triggered across all corporate assets. Preston's mouth fell open as the devastating weight of my words finally crushed the last remaining breath from his lungs. I did not stop speaking. I pushed the blade of my vengeance even deeper. I told him that the federal freeze could not be lifted by any local judge or high-priced corporate lawyer. It could only be lifted after the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Office of Inspector General conducted a comprehensive independent investigation into the potential foul play. I looked down at my unconscious husband and then looked back at the terrified faces of my children. I told them that this mandated federal investigation automatically included a complete, unrestricted, and highly detailed toxicology report. I watched the absolute sheer terror wash over the faces of Preston and Marcus as they realized what that meant. I told them that the federal medical examiners were already waiting in the hospital laboratory to draw Richard's blood and test it for any unauthorized chemical substances, including a highly concentrated lethal overdose of beta blockers. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The realization that their attempted murder was about to be scientifically proven by the federal government completely paralyzed them. They did not just fail to steal the money. They had actively walked directly into a federal trap that I had designed years before they even thought about betraying me. The lead federal agent stepped forward completely, ignoring the forged medical power of attorney that Preston was still holding in his trembling hand. The agent officially informed Preston and Marcus that they were immediately being detained for extensive questioning regarding the suspected elder abuse and the massive corporate Medicare fraud. Preston finally snapped out of his paralyzed state and tried to physically push past the federal agents to reach the heavy wooden door. He shouted that he was leaving to call his legal team and that nobody had the right to detain him without a formal arrest warrant. The federal agents did not tolerate his aggressive behavior for a single second. 2 highly trained agents immediately grabbed Preston by the arms, twisting them firmly behind his back and slamming him roughly against the sterile hospital wall. Preston let out a loud, pathetic yelp of pain as they expertly subdued him. Another agent stepped directly in front of Marcus, placing a heavy hand on his shoulder and ordering him to place his hands behind his back. Marcus did not fight them. He completely broke down, sobbing loudly like a terrified child, begging his sister to help him. Denise stood frozen in absolute horror, watching the federal agents physically march her arrogant husband and her weeping brother out of the intensive care unit. The deeply humiliating spectacle was witnessed by dozens of hospital nurses, doctors, and administrative staff who had gathered in the hallway, drawn by the loud commotion. Preston and Marcus were completely stripped of their dignity, paraded through the hospital corridors like common violent criminals, while the medical staff whispered and pointed at them. Inside the hospital room, Chloe was experiencing a complete and total psychological collapse. The vain white socialite who had just bought an imported luxury sports car with stolen funds began to hyperventilate. She clutched her expensive designer dress, taking short, rapid, gasping breaths as her face turned completely pale. She stumbled backward into the medical cart, sending plastic syringes and medical supplies crashing to the floor. Chloe looked at me with wild, terrified eyes, screaming that she had absolutely nothing to do with the corporate takeover. She cried that she was just the wife and that she did not know anything about the poisoned medication. But her panicked screams were not about the attempted murder of my husband. She was crying because she suddenly realized that the massive federal asset freeze included every single joint bank account and corporate credit card she currently possessed. She realized that the millions of dollars she thought she had successfully inherited were now completely locked behind a massive, impenetrable wall of federal red tape. She sobbed hysterically, whining that she was going to lose her new car and that her pristine country club reputation was completely ruined. I stood in the center of the quiet room, completely unbothered by her pathetic breakdown. I watched the federal agents secure the room, ensuring that nobody could touch the mechanical ventilator keeping my husband alive. The intensive care nurse Maya offered me a small, knowing nod of profound respect from the doorway. I had completely neutralized the immediate physical threat to Richard's life and successfully detonated a massive financial bomb that would obliterate their entire existence. Denise had managed to slip out of the intensive care room during the chaotic physical removal of her husband and her brother. She rushed down the hallway and stumbled into the quiet, empty hospital lobby on the first floor. Her hands were shaking so violently that she could barely hold her expensive cell phone. She was desperately hoping that Preston had managed to transfer some of the corporate funds into their private personal accounts before the federal freeze was officially enacted. Denise frantically opened her secure online banking application, praying for a financial miracle to save her luxurious lifestyle. She typed in her complex password and waited agonizingly for the digital loading screen to clear. When the primary dashboard finally appeared, the screen did not show the millions of dollars she had eagerly expected. Every single checking account, savings account, and private investment portfolio displayed the exact same terrifying number. The balance read $0.00. Below the devastating numerical zeros, a bold red automated banner flashed across her expensive phone screen, displaying a message that completely sealed her inescapable doom. The message coldly stated that all assets were permanently seized by direct federal order. The collapse of an empire built entirely on fraudulent lies does not happen slowly. It happens with the terrifying speed of a catastrophic earthquake, completely leveling everything in its path. The 24 hours immediately following the federal intervention in the intensive care unit were an absolute masterclass in total, undeniable destruction. My greedy children and their spouses had spent the entire month acting like untouchable royalty, parading around the city of Atlanta with their stolen wealth and their forged legal documents. But the federal freeze was an impenetrable wall of solid concrete that completely crushed their luxurious reality in a matter of mere seconds. They woke up the very next morning not as powerful corporate executives or wealthy socialites, but as the primary targets of a massive federal criminal investigation. The grand illusion of their immense wealth shattered into a million sharp pieces right in front of their faces. I sat comfortably in my quiet, rented apartment, drinking my morning coffee and watching every single desperate rat try to flee the rapidly sinking ship. My 45-year-old daughter, Denise, had always believed that her pristine public image was her absolute greatest asset in life. She worked as a senior managing partner at the most exclusive luxury real estate brokerage in the entire state of Georgia. She sold multi-million-dollar mansions to professional athletes and wealthy television personalities, building an entire identity around her fake, flawless reputation. On Friday morning, Denise attempted to walk into her high-end corporate office, completely pretending that the humiliating spectacle at the hospital had never happened. She wore her expensive tailored designer suit and carried her imported leather briefcase, desperately hoping to close a massive real estate deal that would generate enough commission to keep her afloat. But the federal government moves incredibly fast when it comes to massive Medicare fraud. The federal investigators had already contacted the senior managing partners of her real estate firm early that morning. When Denise stepped off the private glass elevator, she was not greeted by her obedient assistants offering her coffee. She was met directly by the head of human resources and two large armed corporate security guards. The human resources director coldly informed Denise that she was officially terminated effective immediately. The luxury brokerage could absolutely not afford to have their prestigious brand associated with a woman who was actively being investigated by the federal government for violent elder abuse and corporate embezzlement. Denise tried to argue, her voice pitching incredibly high with pure panic, but the security guards simply grabbed her firmly by the arms. They forced her to hand over her corporate keys, her company cell phone, and her security access badge right in front of the entire crowded office. She was physically escorted out of the glass building, while her wealthy colleagues whispered and stared at her in absolute disgust. Her perfect, flawless reputation, the only thing she truly cared about, was completely obliterated in less than 5 minutes. She was left standing on the concrete sidewalk, crying hysterically, with absolutely nowhere to go. While Denise was being publicly humiliated in the lobby of her real estate firm, my 42-year-old son Marcus was facing his own absolute nightmare across town. Marcus had always fancied himself a brilliant tech entrepreneur, despite the undeniable fact that every single business he ever started had completely failed within months. A week after they forced me to take a vacation to Paris, Marcus had launched a brand new technology startup company. He rented a massive, modern, open-concept office space in downtown Atlanta, hired a team of expensive software developers, and bought 3 luxury company vehicles. He proudly told everyone in his elite social circle that he had finally secured private venture capital funding to build his dream. But the truth was far more sinister and entirely illegal. Marcus had completely funded his fake tech startup using the millions of dollars he and Preston had illegally siphoned from Richard's corporate operating accounts. Marcus arrived at his modern glass office feeling terrified about the hospital incident, but desperately hoping his startup would somehow survive the impending storm. Instead of his young employees greeting him warmly, he walked directly into a massive, devastating raid conducted by the Securities and Exchange Commission. Dozens of federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with bold yellow letters were swarming his expensive office space. They were actively seizing every single computer server, freezing the corporate bank accounts, and boxing up all the physical financial ledgers. The federal agents had easily and rapidly tracked the embezzled corporate funds directly from the Coleman Pharmacy Group into the startup operating accounts. Marcus stood in the doorway, completely paralyzed by sheer, overwhelming terror. A senior federal agent approached him and formally handed him a thick white envelope containing a target letter, officially naming him as a primary suspect in a massive federal money laundering operation. Marcus watched in complete horror as the agents carried his expensive equipment out the front door, realizing that his fake genius identity was permanently destroyed, and he was undoubtedly going to federal prison. The absolute crushing pressure of their impending federal ruin immediately turned them against each other like starving animals trapped in a very small cage. Later that evening, the 4 of them gathered in the massive living room of Preston's suburban mansion. The house was completely dark because nobody had the physical energy or the mental capacity to even turn on the lights. The atmosphere was incredibly toxic, thick with aggressive blame and terrifying realization. Denise sat in the corner of the room, weeping uncontrollably into her hands. Preston began pacing the hardwood floor, screaming violently at Marcus. Preston blamed my weak, pathetic son entirely for their current destruction. He screamed that Marcus was an absolute idiot for not thoroughly checking Richard's suit jacket before handing it over to the hospital nursing staff. Preston had finally realized that the secret audio recording captured on the encrypted smartphone was the exact piece of undeniable evidence that gave the federal agents the probable cause to raid them. Marcus tried to defend himself, crying and whining that Preston was the one who physically ordered the lethal dosage of beta blockers in the first place. The shouting match escalated into a vicious verbal brawl until Chloe completely lost her mind. The vain white socialite who had happily worn my stolen heirloom diamonds just a day ago threw her crystal wine glass directly against the stone fireplace, shattering it into tiny pieces. She began screaming at Marcus with a level of pure, unfiltered hatred that shook the walls of the dark house. She told Marcus that he was a pathetic, broke failure and that she absolutely refused to spend the best years of her luxurious life wearing an orange jumpsuit in a dirty federal prison because of his monumental stupidity. Chloe ran frantically up the grand staircase, grabbed her expensive designer suitcases, and packed all of her remaining clothes and jewelry. She marched back down the stairs, demanding an immediate divorce and threatening to testify against all of them to save her own skin. She walked out the front door, abandoning Marcus completely alone in his paralyzing terror. Preston watched his entire criminal conspiracy collapse into absolute chaos right in his own living room. He knew that the federal investigators were actively building an ironclad criminal case against him for attempted murder and massive corporate fraud. He knew that if he did not hire the most expensive and ruthless criminal defense attorney in the entire country, he would definitely spend the rest of his natural life rotting in a maximum security federal penitentiary. But high-powered criminal defense lawyers require massive cash retainers up front, and the federal government had successfully frozen every single domestic bank account tied to his name and the pharmacy empire. Preston was completely desperate, completely cornered, and entirely willing to take one final massive risk to save his own life. He went into his dark home office and locked the heavy wooden door securely behind him. He opened his encrypted laptop and accessed a highly secure hidden internet network. Preston had a secret offshore bank account located in a country with incredibly strict privacy laws. He had quietly funneled $5 million of stolen pharmaceutical revenue into this specific account months before the hostile takeover even began. He genuinely believed this stolen money was completely untraceable and entirely safe from the reach of the federal investigators. His hands were shaking violently, leaving sweat on the keyboard as he typed in his complex routing numbers, attempting to wire the massive sum of $5 million directly to a prestigious law firm in New York. He hit the digital transfer button and let out a long, heavy sigh of profound relief, believing he had finally outsmarted the system. He had absolutely no idea that as the top corporate strategist of the empire, I had already discovered that specific offshore account 3 weeks ago. He had absolutely no idea that his desperate digital keystrokes were not sending money to a lawyer. His desperate actions were actively triggering an automatic federal wire fraud alert, walking him directly and inescapably right into my final, beautiful trap. The sheer panic of a cornered animal is a pathetic thing to witness, especially when that animal has spent her life pretending to be an untouchable predator. Less than 24 hours after the raid on my son's fake technology startup and the humiliating public termination of my daughter Denise, I received a desperate text message on my private cell phone. It was from Chloe, the vain white socialite who had married my weak son Marcus. She was absolutely terrified. The federal asset freeze had completely locked her out of every single joint bank account and credit card she possessed, leaving her with nothing but the designer clothes currently packed in her expensive suitcases. She knew with absolute certainty that the federal investigators were actively building a massive criminal conspiracy case against the entire family, and she was completely unwilling to trade her luxurious lifestyle for a dirty orange jumpsuit in a maximum security federal prison. She begged me for a secret face-to-face meeting, promising she had something incredibly valuable to offer in exchange for her personal freedom. I agreed to meet her, but I absolutely refused to allow her anywhere near my rented apartment or my corporate offices. I chose a cheap, rundown 24-hour diner located on the extreme outskirts of the city, far away from the wealthy, pristine neighborhoods of Buckhead. It was a greasy, dimly lit establishment, smelling heavily of burnt coffee and cheap frying oil. It was the exact type of place that Chloe would normally never dare to step foot inside, and that was exactly why I chose it. I wanted her to feel the absolute crushing reality of the destitute life she was rapidly approaching. I arrived at the diner 15 minutes early, wearing a simple but elegant tailored trench coat, and sat in a sticky vinyl booth in the far back corner, waiting for the traiter to arrive. Chloe pushed through the heavy glass doors of the cheap diner, looking nothing like the arrogant woman who had laughed in my face and drank champagne in my living room just days ago. She wore massive, dark designer sunglasses to hide her red, swollen eyes, and a bulky, oversized sweater that completely swallowed her frail, shaking frame. Her highlighted blonde hair was a tangled knot, and she kept looking nervously over her shoulder, terrified that the federal agents or Preston were secretly following her. She slid into the sticky vinyl booth directly across from me, clutching a heavy, oversized leather tote bag tightly against her chest. She did not order any food. She just sat breathing heavily and staring at me with wide, panicked eyes. I sat completely still, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee, and let the uncomfortable, heavy silence stretch out between us. I wanted her to squirm under my cold, calculated gaze. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice a frantic, high-pitched whisper. She told me that Preston had completely lost his mind and that Marcus was practically catatonic with fear. She explained Preston was desperately trying to move hidden offshore money to hire elite criminal defense attorneys, and that he was entirely willing to throw Marcus and Chloe directly under the federal bus to save himself. Chloe leaned forward across the cheap laminate table, her hands shaking violently as she unzipped her heavy leather tote bag. She told me that she was not going to let Preston destroy her life, and that she was ready to completely sell out the entire family to secure her own survival. Chloe reached into her bag and pulled out a sleek silver laptop, placing it flat on the sticky diner table right between us. She kept her trembling hands resting heavily on top of the closed device, looking around the empty diner before lowering her voice even further. She told me this was Preston's private encrypted laptop. She explained Preston was incredibly arrogant, but also meticulously organized. He had documented his hostile takeover strategy on this specific computer. Chloe told me the hard drive contained the chronological timeline of how they forged the medical power of attorney, how they illegally altered the revocable living trust, and how they coordinated the lethal overdose of beta blockers to induce Richard's coma. She whispered that there were saved encrypted emails, text messages, and offshore banking routing numbers, proving everything the federal government needed to lock Preston and Marcus away for the rest of their natural lives. But she did not slide the laptop across the table to me. She held it firmly, demanding a highly specific trade. Chloe looked me in the eyes and laid out her pathetic terms. She told me she would hand over the absolute key to their destruction only if I agreed to officially drop all pending civil lawsuits against her. She demanded that I use my massive corporate influence to secure her a blanket federal immunity deal and provide her with a generous financial settlement so she could quietly leave the state of Georgia and start a brand new luxurious life somewhere else. I looked at the silver laptop and then looked up at the desperate, pathetic woman sitting across from me. Chloe suddenly realized that I was not immediately agreeing to her demands, so she instantly shifted her strategy and attempted to play the innocent victim. Large, fake tears began to well up behind her designer sunglasses and stream down her face. She tried to grab my hand, but I pulled my arm back in absolute disgust. Chloe began to sob quietly in the cheap diner, begging for my sympathy. She cried that she had absolutely no idea they were actually going to physically hurt Richard. She swore she thought they were just going to force him into early retirement and take over the corporate board. She whined she was completely manipulated by Marcus and intimidated by Preston. "I did not know they were going to poison him, Valerie," she cried, her voice cracking with manufactured grief. I just wanted the lifestyle. I just wanted to be a part of the elite family. I did not sign up for attempted murder and federal prison. I stared at her, completely unaffected by her theatrical performance. I remembered the photograph she posted on social media, celebrating her early inheritance. I remembered the exact condescending tone in her voice when she told me to go quietly to a retirement home. I reached across the sticky table and firmly grabbed the silver laptop, pulling it out from under her trembling hands. I looked at her with a gaze as cold and unforgiving as a winter storm. You wore my diamonds around your neck while my husband was actively suffocating on a hospital ventilator. I told her, my voice low and completely devoid of any mercy. You celebrated his impending death with champagne in my own living room. You do not get to play the victim now that the federal trap has snapped shut. You get absolutely no immunity from me, and you get absolutely no mercy. Chloe gasped, her mouth falling open in absolute shock, realizing she had just handed over her only piece of leverage for nothing in return. She tried to grab the laptop back, but I had already slipped it securely into my elegant leather briefcase. I stood up, dropped a crisp $20 bill on the table to pay for my coffee, and walked out of the cheap diner without looking back once. I left her sitting completely alone in the dark, greasy booth, crying hysterically over her shattered future. I walked directly to my waiting luxury sedan and instructed my driver to take me to the downtown Federal Building. I did not wait for the morning. I marched directly into the high-security federal offices and handed Preston's encrypted laptop to Mr. Holloway and the lead investigator of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They connected the device to their secure mainframe and began extracting the horrifying chronological evidence of the attempted murder and the massive corporate fraud. But the ultimate crushing blow happened exactly 1 hour later. Because I had previously identified Preston's hidden offshore account, the federal algorithms were monitoring his digital banking footprint. When Preston had attempted to wire the $5 million to his private defense attorney earlier that evening, his digital keystrokes had unknowingly routed directly through a federally flagged monitoring system. The massive international wire transfer attempt automatically triggered a severe federal wire fraud charge, instantly upgrading his crimes to a national security level. The trap I had carefully laid was now completely sealed tight. The lead federal agent looked up from his computer monitors and nodded directly at Mr. Holloway and me. The undeniable digital proof was finally secured, and the automatic federal wire fraud charges were confirmed. Warrants for the immediate physical arrest of Preston, Marcus, Denise, and Chloe were officially signed and issued to the armed federal strike teams waiting in the dark city streets. The morning of the mandatory federal mediation hearing was bitterly cold and heavily overcast, mirroring the absolute severity of the situation. I walked into the massive glass and steel federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta, wearing a perfectly tailored navy blue suit that projected absolute impenetrable authority. My brilliant attorney, Mr. Holloway, walked closely beside me, carrying his heavy leather briefcase that contained the absolute destruction of my greedy children. We took our seats at the long, polished mahogany table inside the highly secure federal mediation room. Sitting directly across from us were two senior federal prosecutors who looked incredibly exhausted, but entirely focused on securing a massive criminal conviction. We sat in perfect silence, waiting for the traitors to arrive. 10 minutes later, the heavy wooden doors swung open, and my ungrateful family members walked into the room. Preston, my sleazy corporate investment banker's son-in-law, walked in first, followed closely by my arrogant daughter Denise and my cowardly son Marcus. They did not look like the wealthy, untouchable socialites they pretended to be just a few days ago. Their expensive designer clothes looked rumpled, and their faces were pale and drawn from severe lack of sleep. The heavy weight of the federal asset freeze had clearly taken a massive physical toll on their fragile egos. However, despite their completely desperate financial situation, they still carried a sickening aura of unearned arrogance. They took their seats across from me, refusing to make direct eye contact. Preston leaned back in his leather chair and adjusted his expensive silk tie, completely oblivious to the massive legal guillotine hanging directly over his neck. He genuinely believed that because he still possessed the forged medical and financial power of attorney, he held the ultimate leverage in this federal mediation. He thought he could outsmart the United States government and negotiate a highly lucrative plea deal to save his own skin. The lead federal prosecutor opened a thick manila folder and formally began the proceedings. He clearly stated that the government had overwhelming digital evidence of massive corporate embezzlement and severe elder abuse. He warned them that they were facing decades in a maximum security federal penitentiary. But Preston simply smiled a smug, condescending smile and shook his head. He leaned forward and placed his hands flat on the polished mahogany table, attempting to completely take over the narrative. Preston arrogantly addressed the federal prosecutors and completely ignored me. He stated that the federal government was severely overreacting to a simple internal family business dispute. He proudly claimed that Richard had willingly signed over complete legal control of the Coleman Pharmacy Group to him via the ironclad financial power of attorney. Preston smugly declared that as the sole legal executive director of the $40 million healthcare empire, he was fully authorized to make any financial transfers he deemed necessary for the corporate expansion. Preston then presented his absolutely ridiculous and highly insulting plea offer. He told the federal prosecutors that he would be entirely willing to step down from his executive role and return a small portion of the transferred funds. In exchange, he demanded absolute blanket immunity from all criminal charges for himself and my 2 children. He also demanded that the federal government immediately lift the asset freeze on his private offshore bank accounts so he could comfortably maintain his luxurious lifestyle. Denise sat next to her husband, nodding eagerly in agreement, entirely convinced that Preston's aggressive corporate negotiation tactics were actually going to save her from federal prison. Marcus looked incredibly nervous, but he managed to force a small, hopeful smile, believing that his sleazy brother-in-law had somehow found a brilliant legal loophole to protect them. I sat quietly at the table, completely unbothered by his arrogant demands. I looked at Mr. Holloway and offered him a slow, deliberate nod. It was finally time to completely obliterate their entire reality. Mr. Holloway stood up from his leather chair and slowly opened his heavy briefcase. He did not yell or act aggressively. He simply pulled out a stack of incredibly old, slightly yellowed foundational corporate documents and laid them carefully on the polished table directly in front of the federal prosecutors. Preston rolled his eyes and let out a loud, mocking laugh. He told Mr. Holloway that presenting ancient incorporation papers was a complete waste of time because his brand new medical and financial power of attorney legally superseded any outdated corporate charters. Preston arrogantly claimed that he owned 100% of the Coleman Pharmacy Group, and absolutely nobody could dispute his legal authority over the massive healthcare empire. I watched him gloat for a few seconds before I finally decided to speak. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the mahogany table, and looked Preston dead in his cold, sociopathic eyes. I offered him a calm, chilling smile that made the arrogant smirk completely vanish from his pale face. I told Preston that he really should have taken the time to thoroughly read the fine print before he decided to commit massive federal fraud and attempted murder. I kept my voice incredibly steady and completely devoid of any emotion as I slowly dismantled his entire universe piece by agonizing piece. I explained that 30 years ago, when Richard and I first started building the pharmacy business, I was the top corporate strategist who handled all the complex legal structuring. I told them that I did not incorporate our business in the state of Georgia. I knew that protecting a rapidly growing healthcare empire required the absolute strongest corporate shield available in the entire country. I looked directly at Marcus and Denise, who were staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. I revealed that 30 years ago, I had quietly and strategically incorporated the Coleman Pharmacy Group in the state of Delaware. I explained that Delaware corporate law offers unparalleled protection and highly specific complex ownership structures that are completely immune to local hostile takeovers. Preston swallowed hard, his face turning a sickening shade of gray as he finally began to realize the catastrophic magnitude of his incredibly foolish mistake. I continued speaking, making sure every single word echoed clearly in the silent mediation room. I told Preston that Richard was indeed the brilliant public face of the company and the beloved founder that everyone admired. But Richard never owned 100% of the corporate entity. I explained that according to the Delaware Incorporation document sitting right in front of him, Richard only ever owned exactly 49% of the executive voting shares. I paused for a brief second, letting the heavy silence amplify the absolute destruction I was about to unleash. I revealed that I had secretly owned the controlling 51% of the executive voting shares for the past 3 decades. I was the true absolute majority shareholder and the ultimate legal authority over the entire $40 million healthcare empire. I told Preston that the forged medical and financial power of attorney he forced my husband to sign was completely legally worthless for transferring the actual corporate ownership. The document only gave Preston temporary control over Richard's minority share, which carried absolutely zero executive power to liquidate assets or transfer corporate leadership without my explicit authorized majority consent. The sheer profound magnitude of my revelation completely paralyzed the 3 of them. They did not just fail to steal my massive corporate empire. They had completely destroyed their own lives, they had actively poisoned their own father, and they had committed massive, undeniable federal wire fraud for a company they never even had the legal right to steal in the first place. They had traded their freedom and their luxurious lives for an absolute illusion. Preston began to hyperventilate, clutching his chest as he realized his expensive legal strategy was completely annihilated. Denise buried her face in her hands and began to violently sob uncontrollably right there at the mediation table, realizing that her prestigious social life was permanently over. Marcus looked at me with an expression of pure absolute horror, finally understanding that his own mother had completely outsmarted them all from the very beginning. They were entirely trapped in a massive federal cage with absolutely no leverage, no money, and no hope of escape. The lead federal prosecutor looked at the Delaware Incorporation documents and gave a slow, satisfied nod to the heavy wooden doors at the back of the room. The doors immediately swung wide open. 5 heavily armed agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation marched directly into the mediation room carrying thick metal handcuffs that clinked loudly against their dark tactical gear. The lead federal agent walked straight up to the mahogany table and looked down at the 3 broken, terrified criminals sitting before him. The agent did not offer any sympathy or any room for further negotiation. He spoke with a booming, undeniable authority that completely filled the room and sealed their permanent doom. Preston Marcus Denise, the agent announced loudly, pulling the cold steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. You are officially under arrest for attempted murder, massive federal wire fraud, and criminal conspiracy against the United States government. The federal agents aggressively grabbed Preston by his arms and violently twisted them behind his back, locking the cold steel handcuffs tightly around his wrists. Preston completely broke down, sobbing loudly and begging the federal prosecutors for a last-minute plea deal, but they completely ignored his pathetic cries for mercy. 2 other agents firmly grabbed Marcus and Denise, pulling them forcefully out of their leather chairs. Denise screamed my name, begging me to save her, but I sat perfectly still, watching them face the absolute brutal consequences of their own incredibly greedy actions. They had treated me like a disposable nuisance, and now they were being treated like the dangerous, violent criminals they truly were. They were physically dragged out of the federal mediation room, their cries echoing down the long marble hallway until they completely faded into silence. I looked across the polished mahogany table at Mr. Holloway and the federal prosecutors. We had successfully executed the ultimate legal checkmate, and justice was finally permanently served. The heavy doors of the Atlanta federal courthouse swung open. Word had already leaked to the local press about the massive corporate fraud and the attempted murder of a prominent healthcare executive. The concrete plaza outside the federal building was completely swarmed by aggressive local news crews hungry for a spectacular public downfall. Dozens of camera flashes illuminated the gray sky as television broadcasting vans arrived. I walked out of the federal building first, accompanied by my brilliant attorney, Mr. Holloway. We stood at the very top of the massive concrete steps, looking down at the absolute media circus waiting below. I wore my tailored navy blue suit and kept my posture perfectly straight, projecting the absolute calm authority of a woman who had just successfully defended her massive empire. I did not rush down the stairs to avoid the flashing cameras. I stood there claiming my space and waiting for the ultimate humiliation of the children who had tried to bury me, alive. A few moments later, the armed federal agents marched out of the building, leading their high-profile prisoners directly into the blinding light of the media cameras. Preston was the very first to emerge. The sleazy corporate investment banker, who had always bragged about his tailored Italian suits and his expensive offshore bank accounts, was now wearing cold, heavy steel handcuffs. 2 federal marshals gripped him tightly by the arms, forcing him to walk down the concrete steps. Preston kept his head down, trying desperately to hide his pale, sweating face from the ruthless news cameras. But the aggressive reporters shoved thick microphones directly into his path, shouting questions about the stolen pension funds and the lethal beta blockers. He looked incredibly small and entirely pathetic, completely stripped of the unearned, arrogant confidence he had weaponized against me in the intensive care unit. But the absolute true spectacle of the afternoon was the complete psychological collapse of my 45-year-old daughter, Denise. Denise had spent her entire adult life cultivating a pristine public image. She had built a lucrative career selling luxury real estate to the Atlanta elite by projecting an aura of absolute perfection and untouchable wealth. As the federal agents pushed her through the courthouse doors, that entire carefully constructed illusion shattered violently into a million pieces. Denise was crying hysterically, her face stained with running expensive makeup and her designer clothes wrinkled and ruined. The bright camera flashes completely blinded her, causing her to stumble on the hard concrete steps. She shrieked, attempting to cover her face with her cuffed hands, but the heavy steel chains restricted her movements, leaving her exposed to the public eye. The news cameras captured every single agonizing second of her destruction. The wealthy socialite who had coldly ordered me to go quietly to a retirement home was now being physically shoved into the back of a marked federal police cruiser, her pristine public image. The only thing she truly valued in this world was permanently obliterated, broadcasted live across the entire state of Georgia. She would forever be known as the greedy daughter who actively conspired to murder her own father for a massive life insurance payout. Right behind his weeping sister, my 42-year-old son Marcus was dragged out of the federal building by another team of heavily armed agents. Marcus had always been a pathetic coward who hid behind the aggressive ambition of other men. He had used the stolen corporate funds to build a fake technology startup, funding his delusional genius identity with his dying father's money. Now that his entire fraudulent reality had collapsed, Marcus was entirely consumed by pure terror. As the federal agents marched him down the steps, Marcus suddenly looked up and saw me standing calmly at the top of the courthouse landing. He stopped freezing in his tracks and, causing the agents to forcefully yank his heavy steel chains, he looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes and began to beg for my mercy. He shouted my name over the loud, chaotic noise of the aggressive reporters, begging his mother to please help him. He cried that he was incredibly sorry and that he never wanted to physically hurt his father. He pleaded with me to use my massive wealth to hire him a good defense attorney and save him from spending decades in a maximum security federal prison. He sounded exactly like a terrified little boy, begging for his mother to rescue him from the terrifying consequences of his own malicious actions. I stood perfectly still at the top of the concrete steps, looking down at the pathetic, weeping man I had carried in my own womb. I did not feel a single drop of maternal instinct or sympathy for him. I looked at Marcus and Denise, and a flood of memories washed over my mind. I remembered the exact grueling years when Richard and I were first building the pharmacy empire from absolute scratch. I remembered working 80-hour weeks, managing the corporate payroll, balancing the company budgets, and sacrificing every single ounce of my free time. I remembered missing my own birthdays and working through major holidays just to afford the exorbitant tuition fees for their elite private schools in Buckhead. I gave them a life of absolute immense privilege, shielding them from the harsh struggles of the real world. I funded their luxury cars, their suburban mansions, and their lavish high society weddings. I handed them the entire world on a solid silver platter. And in return for my lifelong sacrifice, they had treated me exactly like a disposable nuisance. They had locked me out of my own home, stolen my diamonds, and laughed in my face while they poisoned the man who gave them everything. They believed I was simply an outdated obstacle standing between them and their unearned inheritance. I looked at Marcus as he continued to sob and beg for my intervention. I did not offer him a warm, forgiving smile, and I absolutely did not promise to save him. I looked at him with an expression of absolute cold finality. I had spent 45 years protecting them from their own foolish mistakes, but I was entirely done saving selfish people who only knew how to drag me down. I slowly turned my back on my weeping son and my hysterical daughter, completely severing the deep maternal bond that they had violently destroyed. I walked gracefully away from the chaotic media circus, leaving them to the brutal, unforgiving hands of the federal justice system. Mr. Holloway walked quietly beside me as we headed toward my waiting luxury vehicle, parked away from the aggressive news cameras. I felt a profound sense of absolute peace settle deep into my bones. The heavy, toxic branches of my family tree had been pruned, and the deep rot that threatened to destroy my legacy was finally eradicated. I stepped into the quiet, comfortable back seat of my luxury sedan and instructed my driver to take me back to Atlanta General Hospital. The federal agents had officially arrested the immediate physical threats, but my primary focus was entirely on the man still fighting for his life in the intensive care unit. As the car pulled away from the downtown Federal Plaza, my cell phone began to vibrate softly in my designer leather handbag. I pulled the device out and saw the private, unlisted number of the intensive care ward flashing on the bright digital screen. I answered the call immediately, pressing the phone tightly against my ear. It was Nurse Maya. I could instantly hear the chaotic beeping of medical machinery in the background, but her voice cut clearly through the noise. She was breathing heavily, and her voice was shaking violently, with a mixture of pure adrenaline and absolute joyous excitement. "Mrs. Coleman," she said, her words rushing out in a frantic, breathless wave. "I did exactly what you told me to do, and the federal medical examiners completed the emergency protocols. The aggressive toxicology flush completely worked, and the lethal beta blockers have been successfully cleared from his primary bloodstream." "Nurse." Maya paused for a brief second, taking a deep, shaky breath before delivering the greatest news I had ever received in my entire life. She told me to hurry back to the hospital. She said that Richard was actively fighting against the mechanical ventilator tube. She said that his vital signs were rapidly stabilizing and that he was finally slowly opening his eyes. I lowered the cell phone into my lap, feeling the first genuine tear of profound relief slide quietly down my cheek. The long, terrifying nightmare was officially over. I had successfully destroyed the monsters who tried to steal my empire, and I had miraculously saved the absolute love of my life from the brink of a violent death. The queen had protected her kingdom, and her king was finally waking up to witness the beautiful victory. The ride back to Atlanta General Hospital felt entirely different from the panicked journey I had taken just a few days prior. I was no longer a terrified woman rushing into the unknown, trying to understand a sudden catastrophic medical emergency. I was a victorious queen returning to claim her king after successfully destroying the traitors who tried to steal our massive empire. My luxury sedan pulled up to the main hospital entrance, and I stepped out moving with a renewed sense of absolute purpose. I walked through the sliding glass doors and took the executive elevator directly to the intensive care floor. The atmosphere in the long white hallway had completely changed. The heavy, suffocating tension was entirely gone, replaced by the steady, quiet hum of a highly efficient medical staff doing their jobs without the aggressive interference of my sleazy son-in-law. Nurse Maya was waiting for me near the central nursing station. She offered me a bright, genuine smile that radiated profound relief and incredible professional pride. She gently touched my arm and whispered that the respiratory therapy team had successfully extubated him just 20 minutes ago. She said the emergency toxicology protocols had completely flushed the lethal beta blockers from his system. She told me he was breathing completely on his own and was actively asking for me. I walked slowly toward the heavy wooden door of his private room, taking a deep, steadying breath before pushing it wide open. When I stepped into the sterile hospital room, the massive plastic ventilator tube was entirely gone. The heavy, complicated machinery that had been artificially pumping air into his fragile lungs had been pushed into the far dark corner of the room. Richard was lying in the hospital bed looking incredibly weak and frighteningly pale, but his eyes were wide open. He turned his head slowly as I approached the bed, and the sheer, profound relief that washed over his tired face completely broke my heart. I walked to his side and gently took his trembling hand in mine. His skin felt cool, but the strong, familiar pulse of the man I had loved for 4 decades was beating steadily against my fingers. Richard looked up at me, and a single heavy tear rolled down his face. He squeezed my hand weakly and began to weep. It was not the silent, dignified crying of a proud, powerful corporate executive. It was the loud, agonizing sobbing of a man who had narrowly escaped a violent, terrifying death at the hands of his own flesh and blood. He told me he was so incredibly sorry. He confessed that he had been an absolute fool for ever trusting Preston and Marcus with any aspect of the pharmacy empire. He admitted his massive failure in judgment, his voice cracking with deep emotional pain as the reality of their violent betrayal crashed down heavily upon him. Richard explained exactly what happened on that terrifying night while I was entirely distracted touring beautiful museums in Paris. He told me that Marcus and Preston had deliberately ambushed him in our private Buckhead estate. They had aggressively cornered him in the formal living room, demanding that he immediately sign the medical and financial power of attorney documents. Richard cried as he admitted that he was simply too physically weak and entirely too exhausted to successfully fight them off. He told me that when he absolutely refused to sign the fraudulent papers, Preston completely lost his mind. He described the violent physical struggle, confirming every single terrifying detail I had already heard on the secret audio recording captured by his encrypted smartphone. He said Preston coldly ordered Marcus to hold his arms down while Preston violently injected the massive lethal overdose of beta blockers directly into his vulnerable system. Richard looked deeply into my eyes, completely shattered by the agonizing realization that his own son participated in his attempted murder. He told me he felt his heart rate rapidly crashing and his vision going completely dark. He said his last conscious thought before the heavy coma consumed his mind was a desperate silent prayer, hoping that I would somehow return home early and uncover the terrifying truth before they could successfully bury him. I leaned over and kissed his forehead gently, telling him that his prayer was answered and the greedy monsters were officially locked in heavy federal cages. We did not have much time to dwell on the deep emotional trauma because the federal government was actively waiting in the bright hospital hallway. I gently wiped the wet tears from my husband's face and told him it was time to permanently destroy their pathetic defense strategy. I opened the heavy wooden door and invited the 2 senior agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation into the intensive care room. They walked in carrying thick metal clipboards and small digital recording devices. They introduced themselves respectfully and asked Richard if he was physically and mentally capable of providing an official sworn statement regarding the violent events leading up to his sudden cardiac arrest. Richard slowly nodded his head, his expression instantly shifting from a weeping victim to a fierce, determined survivor. He sat up slightly against the crisp hospital pillows, gripping my hand tightly for emotional support. Richard formally gave his comprehensive statement to the federal investigators right there from his hospital bed. He completely corroborated every single word of the secret audio recording captured by his hidden smartphone. He explicitly detailed the violent physical assault, the forced lethal injection, and the massive hostile corporate takeover they had meticulously planned entirely behind my back. He did not stutter or hesitate, ensuring the federal agents captured every single damning detail of the malicious conspiracy. The federal agents listened intently, taking highly detailed notes as Richard completely annihilated any possible legal defense our ungrateful children could ever try to mount. Preston and Marcus had desperately planned to argue in federal court that Richard had suffered a natural sudden medical emergency. They planned to falsely claim that they were simply acting as responsible heirs, protecting the massive family business during a tragic health crisis. They planned to assert that Richard was already mentally incompetent and that the forged power of attorney was a necessary legal step to maintain the corporate pharmacy operations. But Richard's fully conscious and incredibly detailed sworn statement completely obliterated their entire fraudulent narrative in a matter of minutes. The federal medical examiners had already confirmed the lethal presence of the unauthorized beta blockers in his bloodstream, matching Richard's exact timeline of the physical ambush. The undeniable combination of the physical toxicology report, the secret audio recording, and the conscious sworn testimony of the surviving victim created an absolute ironclad legal vault that no high-priced defense attorney could ever successfully crack. The federal agents formally thanked Richard for his immense bravery and quietly exited the hospital room. They left us completely alone to finally begin the long, peaceful process of physical and emotional healing. We had officially won the ultimate war against the greedy vultures who tried to steal our legacy. While Richard and I were finding absolute peace in the quiet intensive care unit, the brutal wheels of federal justice were aggressively crushing the last remaining hope out of Preston. Preston was sitting in a cold, sterile concrete holding cell at the highly secure downtown federal detention center. He was wearing an uncomfortable bright orange prison jumpsuit, shivering slightly in the freezing air, and desperately waiting for his elite criminal defense attorney to secure a massive bail arrangement. Preston still arrogantly believed that his expensive legal team could somehow manipulate the federal evidence and secure a highly lucrative plea deal to save his luxurious lifestyle. He genuinely thought his extreme wealth could effortlessly buy his freedom. Suddenly, the heavy metal door of the visitation room clanked open loudly, and an armed prison guard escorted Preston's high-priced defense attorney into the small concrete space. The lawyer did not look confident, and he was absolutely not carrying a stack of release papers. The attorney sat down across from Preston and placed his expensive leather briefcase heavily on the cold metal table. He looked at Preston with an expression of absolute, profound professional defeat. The lawyer calmly delivered the final catastrophic blow to Preston's massive, unearned ego. He officially informed Preston that Richard Coleman had miraculously awakened from his medically induced coma just a few hours ago. Preston gasped loudly, his face turning completely pale as the horrifying realization set in. The attorney coldly explained that Richard had already provided a fully conscious sworn statement directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The lawyer stated that Richard completely verified the violent attempted murder and the massive corporate fraud, destroying their entire narrative. The attorney told Preston that the secret audio recording the emergency toxicology flush and the undisputed victim testimony created an absolutely unwinnable legal scenario. There was absolutely no hidden loophole, no procedural technicality, and no amount of stolen money that could save him from a massive federal conviction. The attorney stood up, picked up his heavy leather briefcase, and looked down at the terrified, sleazy investment banker. He officially dropped Preston as a client right there in the cold concrete visitation room, stating clearly that his prestigious law firm absolutely refused to associate with a completely doomed case. The heavy metal door slammed shut, leaving Preston completely alone in the freezing holding cell. He finally realized with absolute undeniable certainty that his luxurious life was permanently over and he was facing decades in a maximum security federal prison with absolutely nobody left to save him. The first 72 hours after a massive federal arrest are designed to completely break the human spirit. The federal government does not care about prestigious country club memberships. When Preston, Marcus, and Denise were marched into the heavily guarded federal courtroom for their official arraignment and bail hearing, they were entirely stripped of their unearned, arrogant confidence. The harsh, fluorescent lights of the courtroom illuminated their pale, exhausted faces and their oversized, bright orange prison jumpsuits. They stood before a stern federal judge who had absolutely no patience for wealthy criminals who preyed on the elderly and stole from federal health care programs. The young public defenders assigned to Marcus and Denise desperately tried to argue for their pretrial release. They claimed that my children were prominent members of the Atlanta business community with deep ties to the city and posed absolutely no flight risk whatsoever. But the lead federal prosecutor immediately shut down their pathetic arguments with a single, undeniable piece of digital evidence. The prosecutor presented the exact digital logs showing Preston's desperate midnight attempt to wire $5 million of stolen corporate funds directly into a hidden offshore bank account. The prosecutor clearly explained to the judge that this massive international wire transfer proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the entire family possessed the financial means and the explicit criminal intent to flee the jurisdiction of the United States. The federal judge looked down at the three trembling defendants with absolute disgust. The judge slammed the heavy wooden gavel down and officially denied bail for every single one of them, declaring them extreme flight risks and clear dangers to the community. They were immediately remanded to federal custody pending their criminal trial. The reality of their permanent destruction finally settled heavily over their broken minds. They were not going back to their luxury suburban mansions or their imported sports cars. They were going straight back into the freezing dark belly of the Federal Detention Center. My 45-year-old daughter Denise had spent her entire privileged life curating an absolute flawless public image of wealth and untouchable superiority. She had sold multi-million-dollar estates and judged everyone around her based on their physical appearance. Now she was sitting completely alone in a tiny cold concrete holding cell that smelled strongly of cheap bleach and stale sweat. She was forced to sleep on a thin, stiff mattress resting on a hard metal slab. Her expensive tailored suits, her imported leather handbags, and her priceless diamond jewelry had been completely confiscated by the federal intake officers. She was wearing a rough, scratchy orange jumpsuit that offered absolutely no warmth against the freezing air conditioning of the federal prison. Her perfectly styled hair was a tangled, messy knot, and her expensive makeup was completely washed away, revealing the deep, dark circles of pure terror under her eyes. Denise did not have her expensive cell phone to scroll through social media or call her wealthy friends for comfort. She was entirely, completely, and utterly alone with the horrifying consequences of her own malicious greed. The woman who had coldly told me to pack my bags and move quietly into a cheap retirement home was now permanently locked inside a miserable concrete box. She spent her days crying hysterically, begging the indifferent prison guards for extra blankets, and complaining about the terrible institutional food. But nobody in the Federal Detention Center cared about her former luxury real estate career. She was just another federal inmate completely stripped of her identity, her power, and her freedom. My 42-year-old son Marcus was experiencing an even more severe psychological collapse in the male housing unit of the massive federal prison. Marcus had always been an incredibly weak and cowardly man who desperately needed the validation of others. He had used his dying father's money to fund a fake technology startup, simply so he could pretend to be a brilliant visionary entrepreneur. Without the massive stolen wealth to hide behind, his entire fake identity completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, pathetic shell of a human being. Marcus was confined to a tiny concrete cell, surrounded by hardened, violent criminals who absolutely despised weak, wealthy men who committed financial fraud. He sat on the edge of his hard metal bunk, shaking violently and staring at the blank concrete wall. He was completely stripped of his custom-tailored Italian suits, his expensive watches, and his arrogant sneer. The heavy steel door of his cell slammed shut every single night with a loud, echoing finality that physically jolted his fragile nervous system. Marcus had completely relied on Preston to orchestrate the hostile corporate takeover, and now Preston was locked away in an entirely different cell block, completely unable to protect him. Marcus realized with absolute sickening clarity that he was going to spend the next 2 decades of his natural life in this terrifying, brutal environment. He was never going to drive a luxury vehicle again. He was never going to eat in an expensive restaurant again. He was going to grow old and completely fade away inside a cold concrete cage, entirely forgotten by the elite society he had tried so desperately to impress. The profound isolation and the absolute terror of the Federal Detention Center quickly drove Marcus into a state of pure, frantic desperation. He knew that the federal public defender assigned to his case was completely overwhelmed and entirely unequipped to fight the massive mountain of digital evidence the federal prosecutors had compiled against him. He desperately needed to hire an elite private criminal defense attorney if he wanted any chance of surviving the impending federal trial. But the federal government had completely frozen every single bank account tied to his name, and my brilliant attorney, Mr. Holloway, had already successfully filed massive civil lawsuits to legally seize his suburban mansion and luxury vehicles as restitution. Marcus had absolutely zero liquid cash and no assets left to sell. During his designated 30 minutes of daily recreation time, Marcus walked slowly over to the row of metal prison telephones mounted on the concrete wall. His hands were shaking so violently that he could barely punch in the familiar digits of my direct private cell phone number. He held the heavy plastic receiver tightly against his ear, listening to the automated federal prison warning message play before the line began to ring. He knew I was the only person in the entire world who possessed the immense wealth and the ultimate power to possibly save him from his terrifying reality. He prayed desperately that I would answer the phone and show him the unconditional maternal mercy I had always provided him in the past. I was standing in the center of my massive, beautifully reclaimed kitchen inside the exclusive Buckhead estate. The entire house had been completely professionally cleaned and perfectly restored to its original immaculate condition. The horrible, lingering stench of their greedy moving-out party had been entirely scrubbed away, and the original heavy locks had been completely reinstalled on the mahogany front doors. I was holding a warm cup of imported tea, watching the golden sunlight stream through the bay windows. My cell phone sat on the polished marble countertop, glowing brightly, as the incoming call from the Federal Detention Center illuminated the screen. I did not reach for the device. I simply stood there, breathing in the beautiful, quiet peace of my own secure home, and let the phone ring until it finally went straight to my automated voicemail. A few minutes later, the digital notification chimed, indicating a new message was recorded. I set my warm teacup down on the marble counter and tapped the screen to play the voicemail on the speakerphone. The sound of my 42-year-old son weeping uncontrollably echoed through my pristine, quiet kitchen. Marcus sounded destroyed, his voice cracking with heavy sobs. "Mom, please, you have to help me," he cried into the prison telephone, his words barely coherent through his hysterical weeping. "It is so cold in here, and I am so incredibly scared. Please, Mom, I am begging you to drop the civil charges against my house. If you just unfreeze my personal accounts, I can afford to hire a real defense lawyer. I promise I will do whatever you want and never betray you again. Please do not leave me in this terrible place to rot." I listened to his pathetic, desperate begging, completely devoid of any maternal sympathy or emotional guilt. I looked around my beautiful, quiet kitchen, thinking about my husband, who was currently recovering in a private elite rehabilitation facility because of the lethal poison Marcus helped inject into his veins. I did not need to hear another single word of his empty, fraudulent promises. I reached out and tapped the red delete button on my phone screen, permanently erasing the voicemail before he even finished speaking his pathetic sentence. The day of the federal sentencing hearing arrived with a heavy gray sky over the downtown Atlanta federal courthouse. I walked into the grand courtroom wearing a tailored, dark emerald green suit that reflected my absolute unyielding strength. The room was packed with local journalists, corporate spectators, and federal investigators who wanted to witness the catastrophic collapse of a stolen empire. Mr. Holloway walked right beside me carrying his leather briefcase while I took my designated seat behind the federal prosecutors. The air inside the courtroom was thick with electric anticipation. The wooden side doors swung wide open, and the armed federal marshals escorted the 4 prisoners into the bright fluorescent light. They were wearing matching bright orange federal prison jumpsuits, their wrists and ankles bound securely by cold steel chains that rattled loudly with every pathetic step they took. They looked absolutely destroyed. Their spray tans had faded. Their designer haircuts were a messy disaster, and the unearned, arrogant pride that dictated their every move was gone. They shuffled into the courtroom and took their seats completely, refusing to look at each other or look back at me. The federal judge, a stern, uncompromising older man who had spent his legal career prosecuting financial crimes and violent elder abuse, took his seat at the high wooden bench. He slammed his heavy wooden gavel down, and the entire crowded courtroom instantly fell into a dead, terrifying silence. The judge looked down at the four defendants with an expression of pure, absolute disgust. He opened the federal sentencing guidelines and demanded to hear any final statements from the defense before handing down their permanent doom. Preston, my sleazy corporate investment banker's son-in-law, was the first person to stand up. He awkwardly leaned into the microphone, his heavy steel handcuffs clinking loudly against the wooden table. Preston did not offer a genuine apology for actively trying to murder my husband and steal our pharmacy empire. Instead, he immediately launched into a frantic, pathetic attempt to shift the blame. Preston pointed a shaking finger directly at Marcus and began speaking rapidly, his voice cracking with pure terror. He claimed that he was just a financial advisor and that Marcus was the true evil mastermind behind the hostile corporate takeover. Preston desperately lied, claiming that Marcus physically procured the lethal beta blockers and pressured him into signing the forged medical power of attorney. Marcus immediately jumped up from his wooden chair, screaming at the top of his lungs and completely losing his mind, right there in the middle of the federal courtroom. The armed federal marshals had to physically step forward and place their heavy hands on his shoulders to force him back down. Marcus leaned into his own microphone, tears streaming rapidly down his pale, exhausted face, and began aggressively blaming Preston for absolutely everything Marcus cried, hysterically claiming that Preston had completely brainwashed him and manipulated his deep insecurities about his failed technology startups. Marcus told the stern federal judge that Preston was a terrifying sociopath who physically forced him to hold his own dying father down on the floor of our Buckhead estate. Marcus whined that he was terrified of his brother-in-law and only went along with the corporate fraud because Preston threatened to completely ruin him financially. It was an incredibly pathetic and entirely disgusting display of cowardly betrayal. They were exactly like two starving rats trapped in a sinking ship, viciously biting and tearing at each other in a desperate, futile attempt to survive. Then it was time for my 45-year-old daughter, Denise, to address the court. Denise stood up slowly, her bright orange prison jumpsuit hanging loosely over her frail, shaking frame. The wealthy socialite who used to arrogantly sell luxury mansions to the Atlanta elite was now crying, huge dramatic tears attempting to play the role of an innocent victim. She sobbed loudly into the microphone, claiming that she had absolutely no idea her husband and her brother were actively planning to commit attempted murder. Denise cried that Preston was a controlling, emotionally abusive husband who manipulated her finances and kept her entirely in the dark regarding the forged corporate trust amendments. She begged the federal judge for leniency, whining that she could not possibly survive a long sentence in a maximum security federal prison because of her delicate social status. Sitting right next to her was Chloe, the vain white socialite who had happily worn my stolen heirloom diamonds while celebrating my husband's impending death. Chloe had secured a small bit of leniency by handing over Preston's encrypted laptop to me, but she was still heavily implicated. Chloe simply kept her head down and wept silently, knowing that her pathetic excuses would not save her from federal justice. The federal judge listened to their pathetic blaming and hysterical crying with an expression made of solid stone. He did not show a single ounce of mercy or compassion for any of them. The judge silenced the courtroom and leaned forward, adjusting his reading glasses as he prepared to deliver his final devastating monologue. He spoke with a booming authority that echoed off the high ceiling, completely crushing the last remaining breath of hope from their lungs. The judge stated that he had never witnessed a more disgusting, calculated, and malicious display of absolute greed. He told them that corporate embezzlement was a serious federal crime, but actively attempting to violently murder a loving father and a dedicated husband for a life insurance payout was an act of pure, unadulterated evil. The judge looked directly at Preston and Marcus, stating that their brutal actions were a massive, violent betrayal of the highest degree. He completely rejected their pathetic attempts to blame each other, declaring that they were both equally guilty and entirely responsible for the horrifying elder abuse and the corporate destruction they had meticulously orchestrated. The courtroom held its collective breath as the judge finally handed down the official sentences. He looked down at Preston, who was visibly shaking and struggling to stand. The judge sentenced Preston to 25 full years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without any possibility of early parole. Preston completely collapsed back into his wooden chair, sobbing uncontrollably as the reality of a quarter-century behind heavy steel bars crushed his soul. The judge then turned his cold gaze to Marcus. He sentenced my cowardly son to 20 full years in a maximum security federal facility. Marcus let out a loud, agonizing wail of pure despair, burying his face in his chained hands. The judge looked at Denise, who was currently hyperventilating, and sentenced her to 15 years in federal prison for her active complicity and willing participation in the financial fraud. Finally, the judge addressed Chloe, stating that while her eventual cooperation provided the digital evidence necessary to expedite the trial, her eager participation could not be ignored. Chloe was sentenced to exactly 5 years in a federal prison for women. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down with a loud crack, finalizing their absolute destruction. The crowded courtroom erupted into loud murmurs and the rapid clicking of press cameras as the federal marshals immediately stepped forward to physically haul the 4 convicted criminals away to begin their long, miserable sentences. As the armed guards grabbed Denise's arms and forcefully pulled her away from the defense table, she suddenly stopped resisting and turned her head to look directly at me. I was standing quietly in the front row, watching the beautiful, flawless execution of absolute justice. Denise completely lost whatever tiny shred of sanity she had left. She began screaming at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing wildly across the packed federal courtroom. She screamed my name, her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure hatred and profound terror. "We are your children. Mom," she shrieked hysterically, her voice cracking under the emotional weight of her 15-year sentence. "How could you do this to us?" The entire courtroom fell silent. The federal prosecutors, journalists, and armed marshals stopped moving and turned their heads to look directly at me, waiting to see how I would respond to the heartbreaking cries of flesh and blood. I did not flinch, I did not shed a single tear, and I felt zero maternal guilt for the hell they were about to endure. I stood up, smoothing the front of my emerald green suit. I looked directly into the terrified, weeping eyes of the daughter I had sacrificed everything to raise. I spoke with a voice that was calm, steady, and as cold as ice. My words carried clearly across the room, slicing through her pathetic manufactured victimhood like a sharpened blade. "I protected my family," I replied coldly, staring right through her shattered soul. "You just decided you were the enemy." I turned my back on them and walked down the center aisle, leaving them to the unforgiving chains of their self-inflicted doom. The heavy iron doors of the federal penitentiary slammed shut on the greedy monsters who used to call themselves my family, but my work was not entirely finished yet. The massive criminal convictions and the long federal prison sentences were simply the first necessary step in achieving absolute total justice. I was not going to allow them to sit in their cold concrete cells and dream about returning to a comfortable life waiting for them on the outside. I contacted Mr. Holloway the very next morning and instructed him to immediately initiate a massive, aggressive civil lawsuit against every single one of them. The federal judge had already formally recognized the immense emotional and physical damage they intentionally inflicted upon my husband. During their violent attempted murder, we used that exact undeniable criminal ruling to rapidly accelerate the civil restitution process, bypassing months of tedious legal arguments. I was the undisputed majority shareholder of the Coleman Pharmacy Group and the sole legal guardian of Richard's personal estate, which gave me absolute, unyielding authority to completely strip them of everything they owned. We targeted Preston's sprawling suburban mansion. First, the sleazy investment banker had built his entire identity on the illusion of immense wealth, but his expensive property was built on a foundation of stolen corporate funds and fraudulent offshore accounts. The The civil court granted my immediate request to seize the multi-million-dollar estate, along with the fleet of imported luxury sports cars parked in his pristine driveway. My 45-year-old daughter, Denise, had spent decades curating a flawless high society image, buying expensive designer wardrobes and throwing lavish catered parties. To impress the Atlanta elite, I legally seized her luxury real estate properties, her joint checking accounts, and every single piece of expensive diamond jewelry she had eagerly purchased with the money she helped steal from her dying father. We did the exact same thing to my cowardly son Marcus and his vain white wife Chloe. Their brand-new modern technology startup was completely dismantled, and their luxury condominium was quickly foreclosed. I ensured that every single frozen bank account, every hidden offshore trust, and every physical asset tied to their names was entirely repossessed by my legal team. They had tried to strip me of my legacy and leave me destitute in a cheap retirement home, so I returned the exact same favor with absolute ruthless precision. I did not want to keep a single item that belonged to them because their material possessions were deeply tainted by their sickening greed and their violent betrayal. I hired a premier estate liquidation firm to completely empty their massive suburban mansions and sell every single piece of designer furniture, every imported rug, and every expensive piece of modern art to the highest possible bidders. The luxury sports cars were quietly auctioned off to wealthy private collectors, and the sprawling real estate properties were quickly sold to new ambitious families, completely erasing their physical footprint from the exclusive Buckhead neighborhoods. I took the millions of dollars generated from the massive liquidation sale, and I completely refused to deposit a single penny of it into my own private bank accounts or the corporate pharmacy ledgers. I wanted their stolen wealth to serve a highly poetic and profoundly meaningful purpose. I contacted a prominent, highly respected Atlanta charity organization that explicitly specialized in protecting vulnerable elderly citizens from severe financial abuse and physical neglect. I arranged a quiet private meeting with the board of directors and formally donated the entire liquidated sum entirely in my husband's honor. The massive financial donation would directly fund legal services, secure safe housing, and provide critical medical care for thousands of elderly people who had been cruelly manipulated and abandoned by their own greedy families. It was the absolute ultimate act of beautiful karma. The millions of dollars that Preston, Marcus, Denise, and Chloe had violently stolen to fund their fake, luxurious lifestyles were now being permanently used to actively destroy people exactly like them. The total, absolute erasure of their unearned wealth guaranteed one incredibly satisfying, undeniable reality. When my ungrateful children finally step out of those maximum security federal prisons in 2 decades, they will be middle-aged, convicted felons with absolutely nothing to their names. They will have no secret offshore bank accounts waiting for them, no luxury mansions to return to, and no wealthy elite friends willing to answer their desperate phone calls. They will be forced to re-enter society completely and utterly destitute, having to work exhausting minimum wage jobs just to survive the harsh reality of the real world. They will finally live the exact, miserable, pathetic lives they entirely deserve, completely forgotten by the empire they so foolishly tried to conquer, while the ruthless legal cleanup was actively destroying the last remaining traces of my former family. I focused my entire heart and soul on the beautiful, miraculous recovery of the man I loved. My husband Richard was officially discharged from the sterile intensive care unit of Atlanta General Hospital after spending several terrifying weeks fighting for his very life. The aggressive toxicology flush had successfully cleared the lethal overdose of beta blockers from his frail system, but the violent physical trauma and the deep emotional betrayal had taken a massive toll on his aging body. I refused to let him recover in the massive, empty halls of our Buckhead estate where the horrifying ambush had actually taken place. Instead, I arranged for a highly secure private medical transport to completely transfer him to the most elite private rehabilitation facility in the entire state of Georgia. The exclusive medical center was nestled deeply in the quiet, lush green mountains, far away from the aggressive noise of the city and the prying eyes of the local media. It was a beautiful, peaceful sanctuary surrounded by tall, ancient trees and blooming gardens, designed specifically to heal both the shattered physical body and the deeply broken human spirit. Richard was given a massive private suite with large glass windows overlooking a serene private lake and a dedicated team of the absolute best physical therapists and trauma counselors available in the country. The incredibly difficult healing process was not just about regaining his physical strength and learning how to walk without assistance again. It was a profound, deeply painful journey of emotional reconciliation. Richard had spent his entire adult life building a massive $40 million healthcare empire, acting as the brilliant, untouchable public face of the Coleman Pharmacy Group. He had always possessed a massive, towering ego, believing that he was an invincible king who could easily control the ambitious people around him. But the violent ambush orchestrated by his own son and his own son-in-law had completely shattered that unearned arrogance into a million tiny, unrecoverable pieces. He was forced to confront the horrifying, undeniable truth that he had been completely blind to the toxic greed festering inside his own home. He had foolishly trusted the wrong people, and his massive ego had almost cost him his entire life and his legacy. During those quiet, peaceful afternoons, sitting together by the beautiful, serene lake, Richard would often hold my hand tightly and weep softly into my shoulder. His tears were no longer tears of pure terror or shock. They were tears of deep, profound gratitude and absolute, overwhelming love. He realized with complete, undeniable clarity that while he was busy playing the arrogant king, I was the brilliant, quiet strategist who had secretly built the impenetrable fortress protecting his life. He apologized to me every single day for not recognizing my immense strength earlier, and for allowing our children to become such entitled, greedy monsters. I did not hold any anger or resentment toward him, because the terrifying ordeal had completely stripped away all the superficial layers of our marriage, leaving behind nothing but the pure, unbreakable foundation of our true devotion. The terrible trauma that was supposed to completely destroy our family legacy had actually forged our bond into something entirely invincible. We spent our quiet evenings watching the beautiful golden sunsets over the calm water, talking softly about our future and the brand new direction of our massive corporate empire. The arrogant, oblivious husband I used to know was completely permanently gone, replaced by a deeply humble, incredibly grateful man who finally fully understood the absolute, unmatched value of the fierce, loyal queen sitting right beside him. I watched him sleep peacefully one evening, listening to the steady, reliable rhythm of his recovering heart, completely free from the terrifying grip of the artificial ventilator machines. Our massive pharmaceutical empire was finally safe from the dangerous predators who had tried to consume it from the inside out. The absolute darkness that had threatened to swallow us whole was completely vanquished, leaving us bathed in a beautiful, brilliant light. We had successfully survived the ultimate betrayal and emerged completely victorious, ready to conquer the entire world over again. The devastating storm that had violently ripped through my family was officially over, leaving behind a pristine, clear sky and a completely unhindered path forward for my massive corporate empire. I did not spend my valuable time crying over the children who had actively tried to murder their own father and bury me in a cheap retirement home. I had successfully protected the absolute love of my life, and now it was finally time to permanently protect the $40 million healthcare legacy we had built from the ground up. Exactly 2 months after the terrifying ambush in our private Buckhead estate, I ordered my luxury chauffeur to drive me directly to the towering glass and steel corporate headquarters of the Coleman Pharmacy Group, located in the bustling heart of downtown Atlanta. For the past 40 years, I had operated entirely in the quiet shadows, deliberately allowing Richard to stand in the bright flashing spotlight as the beloved public founder and the charismatic chief executive officer. I had always been this brilliant silent strategist working grueling 80-hour weeks to manage the massive corporate finances and orchestrate the complex legal structuring that kept our empire completely untouchable. But the terrifying reality of his sudden medical coma and the massive hostile takeover attempted by my sleazy son-in-law Preston completely changed the fundamental dynamic of our entire existence. Richard was now recovering peacefully in his elite private rehabilitation facility, entirely stripped of his unearned towering ego. He formally requested that I permanently take over the primary executive leadership role, recognizing with profound gratitude that I was the absolute true mastermind holding the actual keys to the kingdom. I stepped out of my sleek luxury sedan, wearing a perfectly tailored, brilliant white power suit that projected absolute, undeniable authority. I walked through the massive revolving glass doors of the corporate lobby, and the entire atmosphere of the building shifted the exact second my designer heels clicked against the polished marble floor. The receptionists, the security guards, and the junior corporate executives all stood up perfectly straight, offering me genuine warm smiles of profound respect. They knew exactly what I had done to save their jobs and protect their federal pension funds from the greedy hands of my own treacherous children. I stepped into the private executive elevator and pressed the button for the highest floor, feeling a massive, incredible surge of pure power rushing through my veins. I was officially stepping out of the dark shadows and directly onto the grand corporate throne. The massive executive boardroom on the top floor of the building was packed with the senior corporate directors when I walked through the heavy wooden doors. These were the exact same arrogant older men who had sat comfortably in their expensive leather chairs and completely turned a blind eye while Preston actively infiltrated the company. They were a pathetic, toxic boys' club of highly paid yes-men who cared far more about their exclusive country club memberships and their massive annual bonuses than the actual financial security of the Coleman Pharmacy Group. They had foolishly allowed a sleazy investment banker to forge legal trust amendments and siphon millions of dollars into hidden offshore accounts right under their arrogant noses. I did not offer them a warm, friendly greeting, and I absolutely did not bother to sit down at the head of the polished mahogany table. I simply stood at the front of the massive glass room looking at their pale, nervous faces with an expression of pure, absolute disgust. They genuinely believed that because I was a 68-year-old woman returning from a traumatic family tragedy, I would be incredibly weak and easily manipulated. They thought they could simply offer me a few fake apologies and immediately return to their lazy, lucrative corporate routines. I opened my elegant leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of formal legal termination documents. I did not raise my voice or engage in any dramatic corporate shouting matches. I spoke with a quiet, terrifying calm that completely shattered their fragile, unearned egos. I told them that their blatant, willful ignorance and their disgusting corporate complicity had almost cost my husband his life and almost destroyed the $40 million empire I had built. I handed every single one of them a manila envelope containing their immediate, unconditional severance packages. I formally fired the entire senior executive board right on the spot without a single ounce of hesitation or mercy. I told them to pack their expensive golf clubs, clear out their lavish corner offices, and leave my building before I instructed the armed corporate security team to physically throw them out onto the downtown pavement. The powerful men who had underestimated me for decades suddenly realized they were completely powerless against the true legal majority shareholder of the Delaware Incorporated empire. They shuffled out of the massive boardroom with their heads hung low in absolute humiliating defeat, permanently exiled from the incredible wealth they had so foolishly taken for granted. With the toxic, bureaucratic rot completely eradicated from the highest levels of the corporate structure, I was finally completely free to rebuild the entire executive board entirely in my own brilliant image. I absolutely refused to hire another generation of arrogant, lazy men who relied on their privilege to climb the corporate ladder. Instead, I launched a massive, highly aggressive nationwide executive search to find the most brilliant, fiercely driven, and highly educated African American women in the entire healthcare industry. I wanted women who had been constantly overlooked for major corporate promotions simply because they did not fit into the traditional wealthy boys club. I completely revitalized the entire Coleman Pharmacy Group by surrounding myself with absolute sheer excellence. My brand new chief financial officer was a fierce, brilliant woman with 2 advanced master degrees who immediately restructured our massive corporate debt and secured our financial future in less than 3 weeks. My new vice president of corporate compliance was a former federal prosecutor who shared my absolute zero-tolerance policy for financial fraud. The atmosphere in the top-floor executive suite completely transformed overnight. The heavy, suffocating air of toxic masculinity and constant corporate deception was entirely replaced by an incredible, vibrant energy of collaboration, mutual respect, and absolute, undeniable excellence. We were no longer simply running a massive regional pharmacy network. We were actively building a powerful, impenetrable fortress of generational wealth that could never be stolen, manipulated, or compromised ever again. I implemented incredibly strict, ironclad corporate governance laws directly into the foundational charter of the company, ensuring that no single executive could ever authorize massive wire transfers or alter the medical power of attorney without a unanimous vote from the newly appointed board of directors. I completely secured the massive empire, creating a flawless, impenetrable legal shield around our entire massive fortune. My new team of brilliant executive women completely streamlined the daily pharmacy operations, expanded our lucrative federal Medicare contracts, and actively increased our total corporate revenue by 20% in the first incredibly successful quarter of my new undisputed reign. The sudden, dramatic, and incredibly lucrative resurgence of the healthcare empire under my direct leadership absolutely did not go unnoticed by the national financial media. For over 4 decades, Richard had eagerly taken all the public credit for the massive success of the company, smiling for the flashing cameras, and giving countless arrogant interviews, claiming he was a self-made genius who built a massive empire from absolute scratch. But the highly publicized federal criminal trial of my children had completely exposed the undeniable truth to the entire world. The aggressive financial journalists finally realized that the loud, charismatic founder was actually just the charming public face, and the quiet, loyal wife was the absolute true mastermind holding the actual legal keys to the entire billionaire kingdom. Exactly 6 months after Preston, Marcus, and Denise were officially sentenced to spend decades rotting in a maximum security federal penitentiary, the senior editors of a major global business publication personally contacted my corporate office. They did not want to write a sensational, trashy gossip piece about my tragic family betrayal or the massive federal embezzlement scandal. They wanted to write a serious, in-depth, prestigious cover story highlighting the brilliant financial architect who had silently outsmarted a team of greedy corporate executives and miraculously saved a $40 million empire from total destruction. I agreed to do the exclusive, high-profile interview entirely on my own strict, non-negotiable terms. I absolutely refused to answer a single question about Chloe or my ungrateful children. I only wanted to talk about aggressive business strategy, massive real estate acquisitions, and the incredible supreme importance of legally protecting your corporate assets. The prominent magazine sent an elite professional photography crew directly to my towering downtown headquarters to shoot the prestigious cover photo. I stood in the center of my beautiful, sunlit executive boardroom wearing a stunning, tailored emerald green power suit, surrounded entirely by my brilliant new board of African American women. I looked directly into the camera lens with a calm, powerful, unbothered expression of pure victory. When the highly anticipated magazine issue finally hit the international newsstands, the bold black headline printed right across my striking photograph read, "The Absolute Mastermind, How Valerie Coleman Silently Built and Saved a $40 million Healthcare Empire." The public narrative completely shifted overnight in my favor. I was universally celebrated as a legendary icon. Exactly 1 year had passed since the terrifying afternoon I returned from Paris and found a pending sale sign staked into my front lawn. Tonight, the sprawling Buckhead estate was completely glowing with a warm, beautiful golden light that radiated from every single massive window. The heavy iron gates at the bottom of the long, winding driveway were securely locked to the outside world, but completely open to the chosen few who had earned the absolute right to step inside my private sanctuary. I walked through the grand foyer of my fully restored home, wearing a stunning, custom-tailored sapphire blue silk evening gown that flowed perfectly as I moved across the imported marble floors. The horrible, lingering stench of the greedy moving-out party my ungrateful children had thrown was entirely erased. The house was filled with the beautiful, soft sounds of a live string quartet playing classical music in the corner of the grand living room and the warm, genuine laughter of people who actually loved me. I did not invite hundreds of wealthy Atlanta socialites or arrogant corporate executives to this intimate dinner party. I only invited the small, fiercely loyal circle of people who had actively stood by my side when my entire world was violently crashing down around me. I walked into the formal dining room where a massive mahogany table was set with my finest vintage china and sparkling crystal wine glasses. At the head of the long, beautiful table sat my husband, Richard. He was resting comfortably in a highly advanced, customized medical wheelchair, which served as a permanent physical reminder of the terrible, violent trauma our own flesh and blood had inflicted upon him. His physical body was permanently altered by the lethal overdose of beta blockers, and he would never walk onto a tennis court again, but his spirit was completely, incredibly healed. Richard was wearing a sharp, tailored suit looking incredibly handsome, and his face was entirely relaxed and peaceful. He was smiling a bright, genuine smile, laughing warmly at a joke someone had just told. The massive, towering, arrogant ego that used to completely blind him was entirely gone. When he saw me walk into the dining room, his eyes completely lit up with a profound, absolute devotion that completely melted my heart. He reached out his shaking hand, and I walked over to gently interlock my fingers with his. He kissed the back of my hand, whispering quietly that I was the most beautiful woman in the entire world and the absolute undisputed savior of his life. Sitting directly to the right of my husband was Mr. Holloway, my brilliant and ruthless corporate attorney. He was no longer carrying his heavy leather briefcase filled with legal destruction and federal indictments. Tonight he was simply a dear, trusted friend enjoying a very expensive glass of imported red wine. Mr. Holloway had successfully executed every single complex legal maneuver, flawlessly ensuring that my greedy son and my sleazy son-in-law were permanently locked inside their maximum security federal cages. He raised his crystal glass to me, offering a slow, deeply respectful nod, acknowledging the absolute magnificent victory we had completely secured together. Sitting across the table from Mr. Holloway was a young, beautiful African-American woman who absolutely radiated pure joy and immense relief. It was Nurse Maya. 1 year ago, she was an exhausted, terrified intensive care nurse, secretly handing me an encrypted smartphone in a dark, subterranean parking garage. She had risked her entire medical career and her personal freedom to keep my husband alive and counteract the lethal poison in his veins. I absolutely do not forget the people who show me true, unyielding loyalty in the dark. A few months after the massive federal trial concluded, I quietly contacted the financial aid office of her medical university. I completely and entirely paid off every single penny of her massive nursing school student loan debt. I also legally established a generous private financial trust in her name, ensuring that she would never have to worry about money ever again. She was no longer just a brave hospital employee. Maya was officially and permanently a deeply cherished member of my brand new chosen family. We sat down to enjoy an incredibly lavish 5-course meal prepared by a highly acclaimed private chef. We did not spend a single second of our beautiful evening talking about Preston, Marcus, Denise, or Chloe. We absolutely refused to speak their names or allow their toxic, miserable memories to poison the pure joy of our celebration. They were currently sitting in their cold, concrete federal prison cells, eating terrible institutional food and wearing scratchy bright orange jumpsuits while we dined on imported caviar and prime steak. Their complete, absolute erasure from our luxurious lives was the ultimate beautiful justice. As the private chef cleared the final dessert plates, I stood up slowly from my chair at the head of the massive mahogany table. I gently tapped my silver spoon against the side of my crystal wine glass, commanding the quiet, respectful attention of the room. The string quartet stopped playing, and my beautiful chosen family looked up at me with eyes full of absolute admiration and deep, profound respect. I looked down at my husband, who was smiling up at me with tears of pure gratitude shining in his eyes. I looked at Mr. Holloway and Nurse Maya. I raised my crystal glass high into the warm, glowing light of the dining room chandelier. I spoke with a voice that was incredibly steady, rich with emotion and entirely devoid of the cold, calculating ice I had used to destroy my enemies. I thanked every single person in the room for their incredible bravery, their unwavering loyalty, and their beautiful, genuine friendship. I told them that family is absolutely not defined by the blood running through your veins or the last name printed on a birth certificate. True family is entirely defined by the people who absolutely refuse to abandon you when the wolves are actively breaking down your front door. I toasted to our health, to our massive restored empire, and to the beautiful, unbreakable peace we had successfully fought so incredibly hard to secure. As I took a slow, satisfying sip of my expensive red wine, I looked out the massive bay windows into the dark, quiet night protecting my estate. I felt a deep, powerful voice echoing quietly inside my own mind, perfectly summarizing the entire terrifying journey I had just conquered. Society has a very foolish and incredibly dangerous habit of severely underestimating older women. They look at our quiet elegance and our patience, and they completely mistake it for weakness. They genuinely thought that because a woman's hair finally turns silver, she is simply exhausted and ready to be quietly buried away in the dark. They thought I was an outdated relic who would just surrender my massive $40 million empire without a single fight. They completely forgot that I am the exact architect who designed the entire kingdom. They forgot that I am the one who actually built the graveyard they tried to throw me into. I did not just survive their malicious, violent ambush. I completely redesigned the entire battlefield. I rewrote the federal laws governing their destruction, and I permanently locked them inside the very cages they built for me. I am the absolute, undisputed queen of the Coleman Pharmacy Group, and my reign is finally completely and beautifully untouchable. Have you ever had family mistake your kindness for weakness? Let me know your story in the comments below. Hit the subscribe button to join our community and hear more incredible stories about reclaiming your absolute power against greedy, entitled people. And remember, ladies, never let anyone dig your grave while you are still holding the deed to the land. Protect your peace, defend your empire, and never ever apologize for destroying the monsters who try to steal your crown.